an understanding, as if she had already sensed something was wrong. "What is it, Rob?" she asked, her voice gentle, but it trembled with the weariness of so many long days. Rob swallowed hard, forcing the words past the lump in his throat. "Mother," he paused, the weight of his words choking him. "I don't know how to say this, but Father and John, they're gone." Her hands froze, the light of the candles flickering as her gaze locked onto him, her face draining of color. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, as if the very air itself held its breath. "What do you mean?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, as though she feared speaking the words aloud would make them real. "What do you mean, they're gone?" Rob's heart cracked as he watched his mother's face twist with disbelief, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. She didn't need to hear the rest, she already knew, in that quiet way mothers always knew, that this was not some passing storm, this was a wound that would never heal, a loss so profound that it would forever change the shape of their family. "They were executed," Mother Rob said, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to sound steady. "By Tywin Lannister." Catelyn staggered back slightly, as though struck by an unseen force. Her fingers gripped the back of the chair near the window, the candles she had so carefully lit moments before flickering wildly in their holders. For a long moment, she didn't speak, her back turned to him. The shadows from the flames played against the walls, their erratic movements mirroring the chaos in her heart. When she finally turned, her face was a mask of grief, tears spilling silently down her cheeks. She averted her gaze, unable to meet Rob's eyes. "You know," she began, her voice trembling, "it's been 6 years since your brothers went missing. 6 long years since Bran and Rickon disappeared." Rob blinked, startled by her sudden change of subject. He had expected outrage, anger at the Lannisters, or even sorrow at the deaths of her husband and Jon. Instead, her mind had gone to Bran and Rickon, the other wounds she carried, the ones time hadn't healed. "I've spent more time looking for Rickon now than I ever had with him," she continued, her words spilling out like a confession. "I held on to hope for all those years, believing they were alive, that they were out there somewhere trying to come home to me. And now," her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, choking back a sob. "Now, all I can think is that maybe they're better off dead." Rob felt as if she'd struck him. "Mother," he said, his voice urgent, pained. "Don't say that." "At least then," she interrupted, her voice thick with grief, "at least then, they'd be with him. With their father. With Jon. My babies would have their father to watch over them again." Her shoulders shook as she turned her face away, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. It was as though voicing the thought had unleashed a torrent of guilt and pain that she could no longer hold back. "Does that make me a bad mother, Rob? To wish that they were gone just so they wouldn't be alone?" Rob stood there, silent, his throat tight and his chest heavy. He didn't know what to say. What could he say to ease the weight of grief crushing her? The words wouldn't come, but his heart ached with the need to console her. Her voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the crackling of the candles. "I think I will be with them again soon." The quiet devastation of her words made Rob's blood run cold. He stepped closer, kneeling beside her and gripping her hands tightly. "Don't say that," he said firmly, his voice breaking slightly. "Don't even think it. You have family here, Mother, family that needs you. Torrhen needs you. The girls need you. I need you." She shook her head faintly, her tear-streaked face still turned away. Rob pressed on, his voice softening. "Father and the boys, they'll still be there when your time comes. But not yet. They wouldn't want you to give up on us, on yourself." Catelyn finally looked at him, her eyes red and brimming with tears. "Forgive me, Rob," she said, her voice faltering. "It was only the rambling of an old woman. I'm sorry to burden you with such thoughts." "You're not a burden," Rob said softly, his hands tightening around hers. "You never could be." She offered him a faint, weary smile before pulling her hands free. "There is something that must be done," she said, her tone steadier now, though the pain lingered in her eyes. "You should write to Castle Black. Ask if they would be willing to send their bodies home. Your father was the Lord of Winterfell, and he should be buried as such, in the crypts with his ancestors." Her gaze flickered to the flickering candles, as though drawing strength from the steady flames. And John, he may not bear the Stark name, but this was his home. It's where he belongs. Robb nodded solemnly. I'll see to it. For a moment, there was silence between them, broken only by the soft crackle of the candles and the faint rustling of the winter wind outside. Caitlin exhaled deeply, as if summoning all her remaining strength. Now she said, her voice quieter but resolute, I think I would like to be alone. Robb hesitated, reluctant to leave her in this fragile state, but he recognized the determination in her expression. He stood slowly, bending down to kiss her forehead. If you need me, if you need anything. She gave him a faint nod, I know, she said, her hands folding in her lap as her gaze returned to the candles. Robb lingered for a moment longer, watching her, before turning and stepping quietly out of the room. As he closed the door behind him, the full weight of his own grief pressed down on him. He leaned against the wall outside, drawing in a ragged breath. Inside, he could still see the faint glow of the candlelight spilling out beneath the door. The thought of his mother sitting there, lighting a flame for each of the lives they had lost, was almost too much to bear. But Robb straightened his shoulders. There was work to be done, promises to keep, and a family still to protect. Whatever grief he carried, he would have to set it aside, for her, for Torren, for the North. He could mourn later, when the fight was done. The following morning dawned cold and grey, the skies heavy with the weight of the storm brewing both within and outside Winterfell's walls. Robb stood in the great hall, dressed in his lord's armor, his doublet embroidered with the dire wolf of House Stark. He looked every bit the young wolf, commanding, unyielding, but his eyes betrayed the grief he carried. The gathered northern lords murmured among themselves as the hall filled. Wyman Mardaeus Bulk dominated a corner, his booming voice subdued for once. Lord Bolton sat near the center, his pale blue eyes cold and calculating, while Mage Mormont and Great Jon Umber exchanged grim nods of understanding. They knew this was not a council called for strategy, this was a moment of reckoning. Robb let his gaze sweep across the hall, ensuring every man and woman present had stilled. The whispers quieted as his presence demanded their attention. Roslyn stood discreetly at his side, her hands clasped in front of her, her face drawn with worry but steadfast. She had offered him quiet strength before they entered, and he carried that strength with him now. My lords, my ladies, Robb began, his voice carrying clearly over the assembly. I have summoned you here not for war plans or counsel, but because I owe you truth. Yesterday, a raven arrived from Castle Black. He paused, his throat tightening, but he forced himself to continue. My father, Eddard Stark, and my brother, Jon Snow, have been executed by Tywin Lannister. A collective gasp echoed through the hall, followed by a wave of outrage. Mage Mormont slammed a fist against the table, and Great Jon surged to his feet, his booming voice rising above the cacophony. The lion grows too bold. Tywin Lannister thinks the North will kneel to his butcher's games. Others joined the outcry, their anger like a fire threatening to consume the hall. Robb raised a hand, commanding silence. Slowly, the voices subsided, though the rage simmered in every set of eyes that stared back at him. They died as Starks, Robb said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. They were executed as traitors by Tywin Lannister, but we will remember them as heroes. Their deaths will not be in vain. We'll make sure of it. His gaze swept over the gathered lords, his words carrying the weight of the loss he felt in his heart, but also the determination to honor their sacrifice. Heroes whose deaths must be avenged, growled Mage Mormont, her voice like a war drum, hard as iron, every syllable edged with the steel of her own grief. Her fist slammed down onto the table, and the other lords muttered their agreement, their anger building in the air like a storm on the horizon. And we will, Robb promised, his own hands gripping the edge of the table with white-knuckled force. But we must be smart and united in this. If we attack the Lannisters with all our strength, if we rush to battle in a blaze of fury, we may not have enough men left to face the real enemy, the dead. The room fell into an uneasy silence. The weight of Robb's words lingered in the air, thick and heavy with the realization that they weren't just fighting for vengeance. They were fighting for survival. Robb's eyes scanned the hall, seeking their understanding. But if we wait too long, a voice cut through the silence, sharp as a blade. It was Alyn Umber, stepping forward from the back of the hall, his normally quiet demeanor replaced by a fierce urgency. If we wait, the Lannisters will come for us here. We'll be trapped within Winterfell, caught between the Lannisters' swords and the dead. When the dead do finally reach us, we'll either all be long dead or hopelessly outnumbered, with no chance to fight back. A murmur of agreement rippled through the lords, but it wasn't without dissent. The small Jon, Alin's brother, shot him a venomous look, his face twisted in disapproval. Alin was the second son, a man whose opinions were often brushed aside in favor of his older brother's voice. But Alin wasn't backing down now. He stood tall, eyes fierce, his posture unyielding as he met his brother's glare. The tension in the room thickened, a mix of frustration and urgency. Robb's gaze shifted from Alin to his older brother, then to the rest of the gathered lords. He saw the uncertainty in their eyes, the divide between those who wanted swift vengeance and those who knew the harsh reality of the war they were facing. "We cannot afford to be divided, my lords," Robb said, his voice cutting through the rising tension in the room. He stood tall, his gaze moving over the gathered lords with an intensity that commanded attention. "Alin's right, we need to move quickly, but we also need to be strategic. We can't let blind fury drive us into a situation where we're wiped out before we even face the real threat. The only way we'll survive to fight the true enemy, the dead, is to force Tywin Lannister to retreat south." Alin nodded in agreement, his strong features set with determination. He had said his piece, but he wasn't about to back down. Still, Lord Bolton, always the cynic, raised a questioning brow, his voice dripping with skepticism. "And how, exactly, do you intend to do that, Lord Stark?" Lord Bolton asked, rising slowly from his seat. The older man's voice carried the weight of experience, his posture casual but imposing, as if daring Robb to come up with something more than just a plan based on anger. "Tywin Lannister will not simply turn on his heels and run home just because you want him to." Beside Lord Bolton, his son Ramsay wore a grin so wide it seemed to stretch the lines of his face. There was something unnerving in the way he smiled, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Not when he sees victory on the horizon," Ramsay chimed in, his words laced with venomous anticipation. Robb's jaw clenched, but before he could respond, Roslyn spoke up, her voice cool and composed despite the rising tension. "Forgive me, Lord Bolton," she began, her eyes fixed on the older man, "but if I am not mistaken, Tywin Lannister is not the king." Her words hung in the air for a moment, silencing the room. "King Tommen remains in King's Landing, and while Tywin may think his victory is close at hand, the fact remains that King's Landing itself is vulnerable. The king is still a child, and his heavily pregnant queen, with only a small garrison to defend the city, is no match for a concerted effort." Lord Bolton's eyes narrowed, and he gave a soft chuckle. "What exactly are you suggesting, Lady Stark?" Roslyn didn't hesitate. "I'm suggesting we don't engage Tywin directly at all," she said, her voice firm with the weight of conviction. "We don't need to go to war with the Lannisters right now. What we need is to make Tywin think King's Landing is in danger." The lords in the room exchanged skeptical glances. The idea was bold, risky, even, but it seemed to be taking root. Robb, still standing, looked to Roslyn for clarity. "And how do we make Tywin think King's Landing is in danger?" Robb asked, his brow furrowed in thought. The small Jon, always quick to vocalize his thoughts, grinned and replied before anyone else could. "Oh, it's obvious, isn't it? She's suggesting we attack King's Landing, take the capital itself." A few of the lords chuckled, some out of disbelief, others with the bitter taste of the impossible. But Roslyn shook her head, her expression calm but resolute. "Of course not," she said. "Why would we exchange one battle for another? Moving our forces south would leave Winterfell even more vulnerable. We need to be cleverer than that. What we need is a way to make Tywin believe the city is on the brink of revolt." The room fell silent, and Lord Bolton raised an eyebrow in mock curiosity. "And how would we do that, exactly?" Roslyn's eyes sparkled with a quiet confidence as she continued. "Because all we need are the people of King's Landing. The common folk, the ones who are starving, who are suffering. They are fighting a war they don't understand, and their children are sick while the king and queen indulge in lavish feasts and gifts for their unborn twins. If we can offer them an alternative, someone who represents a break from the Lannister tyranny, Tywin will be forced to react." A few of the lords in the room exchanged glances, their minds working through the strategy. There was a kernel of truth in Rosalind's words. King's Landing was a powder keg, and all it needed was a spark. But what alternative? Ramsay Bolton scoffed, his voice dripping with mockery. The common people of King's Landing are hardly going to listen to the Starks. You'd need more than a few promises of food to stir them into action. Before Rosalind could respond, a voice interrupted from the doorway. Daenerys Targaryen. The room fell silent at the name. Rob's heart skipped a beat as he turned to see none other than Tyrion Lannister standing in the doorway, a knowing look in his eyes. The dwarf had a way of entering rooms unnoticed, but this time his presence was commanding. His voice, as always, was calm but filled with the weight of a carefully calculated mind. Daenerys Targaryen, Tyrion repeated, stepping further into the room. She is your alternative. The room was stunned. Tyrion stood tall despite his stature, his eyes flicking to Rob as if he were waiting for a reaction. Think about it, Tyrion continued, his voice steady, eyes glinting with the sharpness of his mind at work. The people of King's Landing are suffering. They are hungry, cold, and sick. They've lived under the Lannisters' boot for too long, and they are starting to see the cracks in the kingdom's fragile order. They don't care about the games of power being played by the rich and the noble, they care about surviving the winter and feeding their families. Daenerys Targaryen is known to them as the breaker of chains, the one who freed the slaves of Essos and gave hope to the downtrodden. They've heard whispers of her, the Dragon Queen who is said to care for the common people, who seeks justice and freedom. The people of King's Landing want a leader who will give them more than just empty promises of power. They want change. Tyrion paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the lords in the room. Rob could see them processing the idea, turning it over in their minds. Even Lord Bolton, who was never quick to agree with anything, was listening carefully now. She has landed at Dragonstone this morning, Tyrion continued, his voice lowering as if to ensure his next words carried the gravity they required. This is the moment. We send food, medicine, supplies to King's Landing, everything the Lannisters have been hoarding for themselves. We don't just send it with our seal. We send it with a message from Daenerys Targaryen, their new queen. We offer the people of the capital hope, real hope, not the lies they've been fed for years. They'll know they are not forgotten, and more importantly, they'll know someone else is looking to claim the throne, someone who will care for them. Then we wait, Tyrion finished, his lips curling into a slight smirk as though he had already seen the outcome in his mind. We wait for the news to spread through the city. The whispers of a new hope, of a queen who will restore justice. It will be enough to sow doubt in Tywin's mind. He's already stretched thin with his forces. If he thinks King's Landing is on the verge of revolt, he'll be forced to pull his troops back to defend it. He won't be able to risk the city falling into chaos while he's out in the field. Rob's heart hammered in his chest. It was risky, more than risky, but it was their best chance. If they could draw Tywin south, they would have a shot at dealing with the real threat, the dead. But they would need to be quick. Every hour counted. So, we send word to Daenerys, Rob said, his voice firm, the weight of the decision settling on him. But it must all be done carefully. If Tywin doesn't bite, we need to be ready for a counterattack. Rosalind was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on him, before she shook her head. No, she said, her voice steady but resolute. We cannot simply send word. Daenerys is a queen, and her support is not something we can take for granted. We need her, not just for her name, but for her strength. We need her dragons, her army. If we're going to stand a chance, we must meet her, in person. Rob looked at her in surprise, his brow furrowing. Ro, you can't. I can't. I won't lose you too. The plea in his voice made her pause, but only for a moment. She reached for his hand, the familiar touch grounding her as much as it did him. You won't lose me, Rob, she said softly. But I am the Lady of Winterfell, and I cannot stand by while this decision is made without our full commitment. We need Daenerys as an ally, not just a message on parchment. I will go to her. I will speak with her, make her understand that our cause is her cause. He stared at her for a moment, the rawness of their shared grief still so fresh in his chest. He understood why she wanted to go. He knew that her mind was already made up, that there would be no dissuading her. And yet, the thought of sending her away, alone, into a world so full of danger, his world now, the world where everything had already begun to unravel, was unbearable. Rosalind turned back to face the room, her back straight, her presence commanding even in the midst of such grief. The lords and ladies, the soldiers, all waited in tense silence as she addressed them. "I leave today," she announced, her voice carrying with an authority that made even the most seasoned warriors listen. "Lord Tyrion, will you join me?" Tyrion Lannister, who had been quietly observing the exchange, now stepped forward with a sly grin. "I'd be a fool to miss such an opportunity, Lady Stark. How could I possibly turn down a journey that promises both peril and adventure?" Rosalind inclined her head, acknowledging Tyrion's words with a faint smile, though her mind was already far ahead, weaving through the treacherous path that lay before them. She understood the risks, better than most. The journey south would be perilous, and aligning with Daenerys Targaryen was no small gamble. But it was one they could not afford to ignore. The stakes were far too high. Before Robb could respond, a cold voice cut through the hall like the lash of a whip. "Am I the only one who remembers the last Targaryen king to sit on the Iron Throne?" Lord Roose Bolton's words carried a deliberate, venomous edge, his pale eyes narrowing on Rosalind. "You speak of this Daenerys as though she is salvation itself, but have we forgotten what her father did to House Stark? To the north." The room grew tense, and Rosalind turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Bolton's lips twisted into a faint sneer as he continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "You may not know this, girl, because despite your efforts to make us forget, you are not a Stark. You are not even a Northerner." His words hung in the air, a challenge laid bare for all to see. The murmurs in the hall stilled to a strained silence as Bolton turned his cold gaze to Robb. "But you, my lord. You must remember. Your grandfather and your uncle burned alive at the hands of the Mad King. This Dragon Queen is his daughter, born of his blood. Do you think her loyalty lies with the wolves of Winterfell?" Robb's jaw tightened, but before he could answer, Rosalind stepped forward, her back straight, her voice clear and steady. "You speak of blood, Lord Bolton," she said, her eyes locking with his unflinchingly. "But the bloodshed of the past will mean nothing if we do not face the enemies of today." Bolton raised an eyebrow, his amusement barely concealed. "And you believe this queen will spare the north from her flames?" "I believe that the army of the dead will not care for your history lessons, Lord Bolton," Rosalind shot back, her voice sharp but controlled. "And I believe that if we do not seek allies where they can be found, there will be no north left to burn." The hall erupted in murmurs, a tide of voices rising and falling as the lords and ladies of the north exchanged wary glances. But Rosalind's gaze remained unflinching, locked on Bolton's cold, calculating eyes. She drew a steadying breath, her voice firm as she spoke. "You speak of the Mad King as though his sins are Daenerys to bear, but I see no madness in her actions. This is a queen who has freed slaves, who has broken tyrants, who seeks to bring order to a fractured world. Are we so bound by the past that we will reject our only chance to survive the future?" Her words hung in the air, the silence deafening for a heartbeat before Bolton's dry, measured voice broke through. "A future where we are little more than tools to her ambition. And what happens, Lady Stark, when the Dragon Queen no longer finds us useful? Will you still sing her praises when Winterfell burns beneath dragon fire?" Rosalind stepped forward, her voice cutting like steel. "We need her dragons, Lord Bolton. Without them, we cannot face the dead. And I do not speak only of survival for ourselves but for our children. You are a father, surely you wish to see your daughter grow to adulthood. This alliance may be her only chance." Bolton's pale eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a faint sneer. "Or it may be her death sentence. Tell me, Lady Stark, what comfort will your words bring when the north lies in ashes and the Dragon Queen's shadow looms over us?" Rosalind's spine straightened, her voice rising to meet his skepticism. "I will not sit idle while the enemy closes in. I will go to Dragonstone myself. I will meet Daenerys and make our case. This is not a suggestion, Lord Bolton. This is final." Her words silenced the murmurs, the weight of her resolve commanding the room. "You are correct about one thing," she continued, her voice unwavering. "I am not a Northerner by birth. But I am a Stark by choice, by marriage, and by duty. I am the wife and mother of wolves, and I am your lady, not some girl for you to dismiss. The room was deathly still. Bolton's jaw tightened, and he stepped back, his expression unreadable as he retreated to stand beside Tita, his wife, who had remained silent throughout the exchange. Tita's face betrayed no emotion, but her gaze lingered on Rosalind, a flicker of something unspoken passing between the two women. After a long moment, Rob's voice broke the silence, steady and commanding. "Thank you, my lords and ladies. You are dismissed." The lords began to file out, their expressions varying between quiet respect and thinly veiled doubt. As the last of the room emptied, Rosalind let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Rob moved to her side, his eyes searching hers. As Rob watched his wife turn to prepare for her departure, something inside him twisted, a feeling he couldn't quite place. He knew this was the right decision, but he also knew that every moment they were apart, the world grew darker, the stakes higher. He watched her walk away, her silhouette framed by the torchlight, and for a fleeting moment, he felt the weight of his responsibilities crushing him. "Please," he whispered under his breath, but it was a prayer to the gods who had taken so much from him already. The next hours passed in a blur of final preparations. The news of Rosalind's departure rippled through Winterfell, and though most lords understood the necessity of her journey, it was clear that no one took it lightly. She was the heart of Winterfell now, its steady hand and its guiding light. Sending her away was no small thing. As she stood at the gates of Winterfell, ready to leave, Rob stood beside her, his face a mask of stoicism that barely concealed the turmoil within. "You'll return to me," he said one last time, his voice steady, even if his heart wasn't. Rosalind turned to him, her eyes softer than they had been in days. She reached up, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "I will," she promised, her voice firm, but with a warmth that made his chest tighten. "But for now, the North needs you. And Winterfell needs you. Look after Torrhen, don't tell him I'm gone until the morning." With a final, lingering kiss, Rosalind turned, her cloak billowing out behind her as she mounted her horse. Tyrion was already on his own mount, his grin never fading as he waved Rob off. As they rode off into the distance, Rob stood at the gates, watching them disappear into the snow. He could feel the weight of his world shift again, the knowledge that more was at stake now than ever before pressing down on him. He would keep Winterfell safe. He would protect the North. And he would see his family avenged. But as he turned to head back inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that the world, for all his careful plans, was slipping further and further out of his grasp. Chapter 61, Sansa 6. Chapter text. Sansa 6. It had been a week since Rosalind had left Winterfell, and the absence of her presence lingered heavily in the air. Rob had retreated further into himself. His days had blurred together as he spent long hours in his office, buried under maps, letters, and the overwhelming weight of responsibility. He only emerged once each evening to meet with the other lords and ladies, his eyes heavy with fatigue and his mind miles away, constantly returning to the same unresolved questions of strategy, alliances, and the growing threat of the White Walkers. Every night, after the meetings, he would seek out Torrhen, putting him to bed with the same quiet tenderness that had always marked his fatherly love. It was the only time he felt connected to something beyond the looming weight of his duties. Torrhen, the boy who had once been so full of life, so quick to laugh and play, had become a shadow of himself. The loss of his mother had changed him in ways that Rob couldn't fully comprehend. His once eager curiosity had dwindled to silence. He spent much of his time following Sansa around, never straying too far from her side. The nursery had become his new sanctuary, where he would quietly sit, drawing pictures or playing with Daemon. But unlike before, there was no laughter in his games, no spark in his eyes. He seemed to retreat further into himself with each passing day, his playful energy replaced by an almost haunting stillness. Sansa had taken on the role of Torrhen's quiet protector. She tried to engage him, to coax a smile or a word out of him, but most of the time, Torrhen simply stared at the floor, his small hands clutched tightly in his lap. The lively boy who had once filled the halls with his endless questions and laughter had retreated into himself, and it broke Sansa's heart to see him like this. She would often hold him close in the quiet moments, brushing his hair from his forehead, hoping that somehow he would find his way back to the boy he once was. Even Daemon seemed to notice the change. The young boy would look up at Torren with a puzzled expression, trying to understand why his cousin no longer played the games they once shared. In the evenings, Damon would ask Sansa when Torren would smile again, when they could return to their games. But Sansa had no answers for him, only a quiet, sad smile, hoping that with time, the light would return to Torren's eyes. When the boys were asleep or occupied with their tutors, Sansa would retreat to her mother's chambers. Catelyn was ill and growing weaker with each passing day, her body betraying the strength she had always shown. It had begun the morning after the devastating news of Ned and Jon's executions had reached Winterfell. Sansa had gone to check on her mother, but when she entered the room, she found Catelyn still in bed, her usual energy and resolve gone. At first, Sansa thought it might be exhaustion. After all, the weight of so much loss had been unbearable for them all. But as the days wore on, it became clear that this was something more. Her mother's strength seemed to drain from her like water slipping through cupped hands. Each day she grew paler, her appetite dwindling to almost nothing. Servants would bring trays of carefully prepared meals, but Catelyn would only pick at them before turning her head away, her once vibrant blue eyes now dull and unfocused. It pained Sansa to see her this way, a woman who had once commanded respect and admiration now reduced to someone who could scarcely lift her hand to hold a cup of water. By now, Catelyn rarely spoke. She would murmur a few words to Sansa at the start of each visit, her voice faint and raspy, but even that effort seemed to take too much from her. Most of the time, she simply lay back against her pillows, her gaze distant, as though she were staring into a world beyond this one. When she wasn't asleep, she would listen quietly as Sansa spoke, offering no response beyond a soft nod or the faintest twitch of her lips. Sansa filled the silence with stories of her day, recounting small moments with Arya, Torren, and Daemon. She spoke of the boys' lessons, of Daemon's endless curiosity and Torren's quiet thoughtfulness. She told her mother about Arya's sharp wit and the way she had taken to teaching the boys how to wield wooden practice swords. Sansa hoped that these stories would bring her mother some measure of comfort, that they would remind her of the life still thriving in Winterfell, even as hers seemed to slip away. One afternoon, Sansa had decided to bring Torren and Daemon to visit their grandmother, hoping the sight of the boys might spark something in Catelyn, a smile, a spark of vitality, or even a fleeting moment of joy. The boys had been eager at first, carrying flowers they'd picked from the garden, their small hands clutching the delicate blooms as they made their way to her chambers. But when they entered the room, their eagerness faded. Torren's grip on Sansa's hand tightened, and Daemon clutched his flowers to his chest, his wide eyes fixed on his grandmother. Catelyn, once so vibrant and full of life, lay motionless against her pillows. Her skin was pale, her frame thinner than they had ever seen, and the sight of her laboured breathing unsettled the boys. "Grandmother." Torren's voice was soft, uncertain. Catelyn's eyes fluttered open at the sound, and for a brief moment, there was a glimmer of recognition. She lifted a frail hand, managing the faintest of smiles, but the effort was clearly taxing. "Torren." "Daemon," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The boys stepped closer, their flowers forgotten in their hands. Daemon reached out to place his on the bedside table, but his movements were hesitant, as though he feared getting too close. Torren lingered by Sansa's side, his usual courage replaced by a quiet, trembling apprehension. Catelyn's smile faltered as she saw the worry etched on their young faces. She reached for them, her hand shaking, but the sight seemed to overwhelm the boys. Torren buried his face in Sansa's skirts, and Daemon's lip quivered as tears welled in his eyes. Sansa knelt to comfort them, her own heart breaking as she realized the visit was causing more harm than good. After the boys had left, their flowers still lying on the table untouched, Catelyn summoned what little strength she had to speak to Sansa. Her voice was weak but firm, laced with the determination that had always defined her. "Don't bring them again," she said, the words slow and deliberate. "I don't want them to see me like this. I want them to remember me, as I was. Strong. Whole. Not," she trailed off, her hand dropping to her side as if even speaking had sapped the last of her energy. Sansa nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She wanted to argue, to tell her mother that the boys needed her, that they would want to be by her side. But the look in Catelyn's eyes silenced her. There was a kind of acceptance there, a quiet resignation that Sansa couldn't bring herself to challenge. The days passed in a blur of sorrow and routine. Each morning, Maester Potis, the maester that had replaced Lewin, came to Caitlyn's chambers, bringing new medicines and mixtures in the hope of restoring her strength. He examined her carefully, his brow furrowed with concern as he adjusted her treatments. Sangza watched anxiously, clinging to the faintest hope that one of his remedies might bring about a change. But nothing worked. The medicines went untouched more often than not, and even when Caitlyn did take them, they seemed to have no effect. Her strength continued to wane, her body growing weaker with each passing day. One evening, Rob joined Sangza at their mother's side. He had been distant in recent days, consumed by the weight of leadership and the looming threat of war, but tonight he stayed, his hand resting on Caitlyn's as he sat beside her bed. His face was grave, his eyes red-rimmed from sleepless nights and unspoken grief. As the quiet settled over the room, Maester Potis entered, his expression somber. He hesitated for a moment, glancing between Sangza and Rob before speaking. "My lord, my lady," he began, his tone gentle but unwavering. "I have done all that I can. There is no physical ailment that I can cure. Your mother's body is failing because her spirit has been broken. She has given in to her grief, and," he paused, as if searching for the right words. "She has chosen to let go. For that, there is no remedy." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Rob's jaw tightened, his hand clenching around his mother's frail fingers. Sangza felt the weight of them settle in her chest, crushing the fragile hope she had been clinging to. "She's just tired," Rob said finally, his voice rough with denial. "She'll get better. She just needs more time." Maester Potis's gaze softened, but he said nothing. His silence spoke louder than words. Sangza reached for her brother's hand, her own trembling as she clasped it. "Rob," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. We have to be with her. While we still can." Rob closed his eyes, his shoulders shaking as he struggled to contain the storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Finally, he nodded, his grip on their mother's hand tightening as if he could will her to stay just a little longer. That night, as the chill of winter pressed against the stone walls of Winterfell, Rob and Sangza remained steadfast at their mother's bedside. The chamber was dimly lit by a single flickering candle, its warm glow casting long shadows over Caitlyn's fragile form. She drifted in and out of restless sleep, her breaths shallow and uneven, her once commanding presence reduced to this quiet, flickering light. Rob sat closest to her, his hand wrapped around hers, his thumb gently tracing over her knuckles. His voice was low but steady as he spoke, recounting the memories that had been etched into his heart. "I remember when you rode south for father," he began, his gaze fixed on her face as if willing her to hear him. "You didn't hesitate, not for a moment. You were so strong, mother. You always were. You risked everything to bring him back, to protect us." Sangza, seated on the opposite side, listened quietly as Rob continued, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wiped away a tear that slipped down her cheek as Rob's voice softened, tinged with emotion. "And when I married Roslyn," Rob said, a small, bittersweet smile crossing his lips, "you smiled so brightly. You told me I'd made the right choice, even when I doubted myself. And when we came home to Winterfell after the war," his voice broke, just for a moment, but he composed himself quickly. "When you welcomed us, it felt like we'd found peace again." Sangza reached for her mother's other hand, her fingers trembling as they intertwined with Caitlyn's. "I remember the last time we were all here," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You and father. Rob, Arya, Bran, Rickon, Jon, and me. We were all together. It feels like a lifetime ago now." Her voice cracked, and she swallowed hard, her eyes glistening. "Soon, there'll only be 3 of us left." The weight of their grief hung heavy in the air, unspoken yet palpable. As the hours passed, the night deepened, and the room seemed to grow colder. Caitlyn's breaths grew shorter and shallower, her chest barely rising with each strained inhalation. Sangza clung to her hand, tears streaming down her face, while Rob leaned closer, his voice breaking as he whispered to her. "Mother," he said, his voice raw with emotion, "it's okay. We'll be okay, we'll take care of each other. You don't have to fight anymore. You can rest now. You can go. You can be with father again, with Bran and Rickon and Jon." Sangza sobbed quietly, burying her face in the blanket draped over her mother's frail form. Rob's grip on Caitlin's hand tightened for a moment, as if to anchor her, but then he let go, his hand trembling as he wiped at his own tears. Caitlin's lips moved faintly, though no sound came. Her breathing slowed, each breath lighter than the last, until finally, with a soft exhale, she was still. The room seemed to hold its breath, the silence stretching on for what felt like an eternity. Rob leaned forward, pressing a kiss to her forehead, his tears falling freely now. "Goodbye, mother," he whispered. Sangza could only nod through her sobs, her hand still clutching her mother's. The candlelight flickered, casting one final glow over Caitlin's serene face before the flame guttered out, leaving the chamber in quiet darkness. In that moment, the loss was suffocating, but so too was the love that filled the room, a bond that would carry them forward, even in the face of such profound grief. __________________. Rob had arranged for the funeral to take place the following evening. He would have preferred to wait a little longer to allow more time for preparation and reflection, but with the threat of an army capable of raising the dead looming closer each day, he dared not delay. The risk was too great, and he could not afford to take any chances. The ceremony was to be held in the Godswood. Though their mother had not been a Stark by birth, she had lived and loved as one in every way that mattered. She would be remembered as a Stark in both name and spirit. Sangza found herself unprepared for the occasion in more ways than one. When she had packed for Arya's wedding, she hadn't thought to include any mourning dresses. Rob, noticing her predicament, had offered one of Roslyn's dresses, but the size difference between the two women proved to be a problem. Roslyn was significantly shorter, and her dresses were ill-suited for Sangza's taller frame, leaving her with few options. In the end, Sangza was forced to wear one of their mother's old dresses. As she slipped into the black gown, Sangza was struck by a flood of emotions. The dress, though a better fit than Roslyn's, was still tight in some places and awkward in others. Yet the act of donning it felt deeply personal, even comforting, despite the physical discomfort. Wearing her mother's dress was a way to honor her memory, to feel close to her once more. At the same time, it was a mournful experience, as every stitch and seam seemed to echo the absence of the woman who had once filled it. Sangza felt both embraced and burdened by the weight of her grief, wrapped in the fabric of a life that had now passed. As she stood before the mirror, adjusting the gown, she thought of her mother and all she had endured to protect their family. The dress smelled faintly of lavender, a scent Sangza had always associated with her mother. Though the Godswood awaited her, and with it the solemn duty of saying goodbye, Sangza took a moment to steady herself, letting her hand rest on the fabric over her heart. She resolved to carry her mother's strength into the ceremony, knowing that her family would need it just as much as she did. "Are you ready?" Tyrion's voice was soft as he leaned against the doorway, his expression carefully composed, though his eyes betrayed the sorrow he felt. Standing beside him, Daemon fidgeted with his small hands. She nodded, though her throat tightened as she tried to steady her breathing. Crossing the room to kneel before her son, she gently took his hands in hers. "We're going to say goodbye to your grandmama today," she explained, her voice trembling slightly but warm with affection. "I thought it would be nice if you held one of her handkerchiefs during the ceremony, so it'll feel like she's still with you." Daemon's brow furrowed as he processed her words, but his hands eagerly accepted the piece of fabric she held out to him. It was exquisitely embroidered, a delicate combination of fish and wolves swimming and running in an intricate design. In one corner, the letters CT were stitched with precision, in the opposite corner, CS stood in matching thread. "It's the handkerchief she made for her wedding to your grandfather," Sangza said, her voice soft as she ran her fingers over the fabric. "It meant a great deal to her, and now it can mean something special to you." Daemon stared at the handkerchief, his small fingers tracing the stitching. He looked up at her, his eyes wide and uncertain. "Papa told me she isn't truly gone," he said quietly, his voice catching Sangza off guard. Sangza's head tilted slightly in surprise, her gaze shifting to Tyrion, who stood watching them with a tender, almost apologetic smile. "He said she'll always be with me, watching me, looking after me." "Exactly," Tyrion affirmed, stepping into the room and resting a hand on his son's small shoulder. "When people we love leave us, Daemon, they're never truly gone. They stay here." He placed his hand lightly over the boy's chest, where his heart beat steadily beneath the fabric of his tunic. "As long as you keep them in your memories, they'll always be a part of you." Damon clutched the handkerchief tightly, his lip quivering slightly as he looked at it again. "So she'll be with me forever?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sansa smiled softly, leaning forward to press a kiss to his forehead. "Forever," she promised. Damon nodded, his resolve steadying as he wiped at his eyes with the back of his free hand. "I'm ready," he said, his voice stronger now, though it still carried the weight of his young grief. Tyrion straightened, giving Damon's hair a gentle ruffle before meeting Sansa's eyes. "It's a difficult day," he said quietly, his gaze warm with support. "But we'll get through it together." Sansa rose to her feet, her hands smoothing down her gown as she took a deep breath. "Yes," she said, her voice firm despite the ache in her heart. "We will." As the three of them made their way down the quiet corridors of Winterfell, Daemon holding tightly to the handkerchief, Sansa felt the grief pressing on her like the weight of the stone walls around her. But as she glanced down at her son, her heart swelled with determination. She would carry this burden, and she would help Daemon carry his, for her mother's memory and for the future they still had to build. As they entered the Godswood, the cold northern air clinging to their skin, Sansa's eyes swept over the gathering. Torrhen stood near the front, his small figure framed by Arya and Alynh. His dark tunic seemed to swallow him whole, and though he stood tall, his face betrayed the confusion and sadness of a child trying to make sense of the incomprehensible. Around them, the lords and ladies of the north were gathered, their faces solemn, their breaths misting in the air as they waited in reverent silence. Yet one figure was conspicuously absent. Sansa walked steadily toward Torrhen, her hand firmly clasped around Daemon's, while Tyrion matched her pace just behind. Daemon clutched the embroidered handkerchief tightly, his knuckles white, as though it were a lifeline. When they reached Arya, Sansa released Daemon's hand to embrace her sister. Arya's arms wrapped around her with a stiffness that spoke of the emotional walls she had hastily built. "Where is Robb?" Sansa whispered, her voice barely audible as she pulled back to look into Arya's face. As Lord of Winterfell, Robb should have been here already, standing ready to lead their family in this farewell. Arya's lips tightened into a thin line, and her voice was low and gruff when she finally answered, "He wanted to bring her in himself." Sansa frowned, glancing instinctively toward the far edge of the Godswood, but her brother was nowhere in sight. She turned her attention back to Arya, who stared ahead, her jaw set in a way that Sansa recognized too well. Over the past 2 weeks, Arya had not shed a single tear, not for their father, not for their brother Jon, and not for their mother. Her grief seemed locked away, unreachable, leaving her pale and hollow-eyed, a shell of the vibrant girl she once was. Sansa touched Arya's arm gently, but her sister didn't react, her gaze fixed on the weirwood tree as though she couldn't bear to meet anyone's eyes. Beside her, Alynh stood awkwardly, his discomfort plain. Marriage to Arya had never been an easy undertaking, and the weight of her loss now seemed to stretch the fragile bond between them even thinner. In the short 2 months since their wedding, Arya had lost not only both parents but also Jon. Whatever chance Alynh might have had to truly reach her seemed as distant as the sun on a winter's day. Sansa's heart ached for her sister, for the weight Arya carried and the pain she refused to show. She opened her mouth to say something, but before the words came, a low murmur rippled through the crowd. Heads turned, and Sansa followed their gaze. At the edge of the Godswood, Robb appeared, a solitary figure pulling the cart bearing their mother's body. He had insisted, Sansa realized with a pang, on doing this himself. Even from a distance, she could see the strain in his features, the tightness in his shoulders. His grief was raw, unhidden, and it clung to him like a shroud. Robb's steps were slow but deliberate, and as he came closer, the gathered lords and ladies parted to let him pass, their heads bowing in respect. Sansa's breath caught as she saw their mother's form. Catelyn was wrapped in her finest gown, the stark direwolf embroidered in silver thread over the grey wool. Her hair was brushed and smooth, though streaked with white that seemed more pronounced now in death. The sight was both beautiful and devastating. Robb reached the center of the Godswood and stopped before the weirwood tree. He stood still for a moment, staring down at their mother's body as if he could will her back to life. Then, with a heavy breath, he looked up, his eyes meeting Sansa's briefly before he turned to the crowd. "My mother," Robb began, his voice hoarse but steady, "was the heart of our family. She was a shield for us all, a fierce protector who gave everything for her children and her home. She stood tall in the face of every trial, and now she rests in the arms of our father." Sangza felt her throat tighten, tears pricking her eyes as she listened to her brother. Rob's voice faltered for a moment, but he pressed on. We are here today not only to mourn her passing but to honor her life. Catelyn Stark was a woman of courage, of strength, and of love. And though she is gone, she lives on in us, in our memories, in the values she taught us, and in the bonds we share as her children. Rob's words washed over the gathered crowd, resonating with the quiet power of his grief. Sansa reached for Daemon's hand, gripping it tightly as tears began to roll down her cheeks. Her son clutched the handkerchief, holding it close to his chest, his young face etched with confusion and sorrow. As Rob stepped aside, Sansa found herself moving forward, her steps light yet deliberate. She knelt before her mother's body. "Goodbye, mother," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'll make you proud. I swear it." When she rose, Daemon stepped forward hesitantly, holding Tyrion's hand for support. Sansa watched as her son reached out and gently placed the handkerchief atop his grandmother's folded hands, his gesture both tender and brave. The sight broke something in Sansa, and she turned away. Tyrion instinctively took her hands in his, stroking them gently and subtly with his fingers. One by one, the family came forward, each saying their own silent goodbyes. Arya's face remained stone-like as she stepped closer, her voice low and inaudible as she whispered something Sansa couldn't catch. When she returned to Alan's side, her hand lingered in his. The ceremony concluded. Several of the gathered lords, their faces etched with sorrow and respect, stepped forward to help Robb carry their mother's body. Catelyn Stark's form, now wrapped in her funeral shroud, was lifted carefully onto the wooden stretcher and borne toward the courtyard. Sansa and Arya followed in silence, their steps heavy with the weight of grief. In the courtyard, the pyre awaited. Its structure was simple but sturdy, built of oak and pine, the wood stacked high and doused with oil to ensure it burned brightly and completely. The Stark banner hung solemnly nearby, its direwolf sigil rippling faintly in the biting northern wind. The lords and ladies of the north began to disperse. Tyrion, standing beside Sansa, exchanged a look with her that spoke volumes. Without a word, he gently took Daemon's small hand in his and gestured for Torrhen to follow. Alan stepped forward, his expression as awkward as it was kind, and joined Tyrion in shepherding the boys back toward the nursery. "They shouldn't see this," Tyrion murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Daemon clutched his father's hand tightly, casting one last glance over his shoulder toward the pyre before letting himself be led away. Torrhen hesitated, his small body trembling, but when Sansa crouched and whispered, "Go with them. Be strong for Daemon, for me," he nodded reluctantly and followed his cousin. As the doors to the keep closed behind them, only Robb, Sansa, and Arya remained. The courtyard was quiet now except for the faint rustle of the wind and the steady crackle of torches. Robb stood closest to the pyre, his face a mask of grim determination as he prepared himself for what must come. Sansa and Arya flanked him, their grief palpable in the silence that stretched between them. For a long moment, they simply stared at the pyre. Catelyn's body, wrapped in the stark white of her shroud, seemed almost peaceful atop the carefully arranged logs. And then finally, Robb stepped closer to the pyre. The torch in his hand wavered for a moment as he took a steadying breath. With a swift motion, he pressed it to the oil-soaked wood. The fire caught quickly, flames licking hungrily at the pyre as they rose higher and higher. The warmth spread through the icy courtyard, but it did little to ease the cold gripping Sansa's heart. As the fire consumed the pyre, the siblings stood together, watching in silence. The flames crackled and roared, the light reflecting in their tear-filled eyes. Robb's hand clenched into a fist at his side, his grief manifesting in the rigid set of his shoulders. Sansa stood still, her face streaked with silent tears, while Arya's expression remained eerily calm. "I hope she finds them," Arya said quietly, breaking the silence. "Father. Jon. Maybe even Bran and Rickon." Her voice cracked on the last names, and for the first time, her composure faltered. She wiped her face roughly with her sleeve, unwilling to let the tears linger. "She will," Robb replied, his voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "If anyone deserves peace, it's her." As the pyre burned down to embers, the three of them remained, rooted in place. Sansa felt the weight of her mother's loss settle deeper into her chest, but she also felt a flicker of resolve. They had lost so much, but they were still here. Still standing. Eventually, as the flames dimmed and the night deepened, Rob turned to his sisters. "Come," he said softly. "We need rest." Sansa glanced back at the smoldering pyre one last time before following her brother. Arya lingered a moment longer, her dark silhouette framed by the dying light. Finally, with a heavy breath, she turned and walked away, leaving the courtyard silent and empty beneath the cold northern sky. Chapter 62, Margaery v. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Margaery v. The labor had begun in the earliest hours of the morning, waking Margaery from a restless sleep with the first unmistakable pangs of pain. At first, she had felt nothing but relief. Relief that this pregnancy, with all its demands, discomforts, and constant scrutiny, was finally nearing its end. Relief that soon Tommen would have his heir and the throne would be further secured. Relief that Cersei and Qyburn would no longer hover around her like vultures, veiling their invasive concerns as maternal care. But then the pain came, a searing, relentless agony that offered no respite, and with it, the realization that this would be a battle as much as a birth. Tommen had been by her side at the start, holding her hand and fretting anxiously as the contractions deepened. He had looked so young, his face pale and drawn, his wide eyes filled with helplessness. Every so often, he would apologize. "I'm so sorry," Margaery he'd whispered, gripping her hand tightly. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know it would be like this." Margaery, between breaths and groans, had tried to soothe him. "Tommen, love, it's not your fault," she'd murmured, though as the hours dragged on and the pain sharpened, she'd found herself growing silent. She couldn't waste energy comforting him, not when she was the one enduring the ordeal. As the first light of dawn crept into the chamber, Cersei arrived, sweeping into the room with the air of one who had done this before and knew exactly what was needed. She assessed the scene with a cool gaze, then placed a hand on Tommen's shoulder. "You should step away for a while," she said, her tone firm but not unkind. "This is not something you can help with, my sweet boy. Let the Queen focus, and let the midwives do their work. Come with me." Margaery, barely coherent from the pain, nodded faintly. She was almost grateful when Cersei led Tommen away. His nervous presence had started to grate on her fraying nerves. Not long after, her own family began to arrive. Her mother, Aeleri, appeared first, with her serene composure offering a comforting contrast to the chaos of the moment. Then came Olenna, sharp-eyed and brisk, taking in the situation with her usual unflinching demeanor. Behind them came a gaggle of Tyrell cousins, all chatter and curiosity, their concern genuine but their presence overwhelming. Out Margaery hissed through clenched teeth, her voice surprisingly strong despite her exhaustion. "All of you out. Except mother and grandmother." The cousins exchanged glances but obeyed, filing out of the room with hushed whispers and backward glances. Once they were gone, Olenna took a seat near the bed, her sharp tongue uncharacteristically subdued. "Well, my girl," she said, her voice low but steady. "You've faced trials before, but this one will be worth it. Tyrells are strong, and you'll see this through as you always do, with grace and determination." Margaery managed a faint, pained smile at her grandmother's words, even as another contraction racked her body. Aeleri pressed a cool cloth to her forehead, murmuring soothing words of encouragement. "Breathe, darling," her mother said softly. "This pain will pass. Think of what waits at the end of it." The hours dragged on, each one blending into the next as the labor stretched into the afternoon. The chamber grew stifling, the air heavy with tension and the smell of sweat and herbs. The midwives flitted about like nervous birds, murmuring instructions and preparing linens. By the time the sun was high in the sky, Margaery felt as though she had nothing left to give. "I can't," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "I can't do this anymore." "Yes, you can," Olenna snapped, her tone sharp but laced with affection. "Don't be foolish. You've survived worse than this." And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first cry rang out. A baby's wail filled the room, cutting through the tension like a knife. "It's a girl, Your Grace," one of the midwives announced, her voice steady as she held up a squalling, red-faced infant. The room stilled for a moment as everyone took in the child's arrival. Aeleri stepped forward with calm assurance, gently taking the baby from the midwife's hands. She cradled the tiny bundle close, her experienced eyes assessing the newborn's health before bringing her to Margary's side. For a fleeting moment, relief washed over Margary, but it was quickly chased by a flicker of dread. What if she had two girls? What if there was no son? The thought struck her like a cold wave, and her heart sank. She knew what it would mean: Cersei and Tywin's thinly veiled pressure, their insistence on her producing an heir for the Iron Throne, would not relent. She would have to endure this again, another pregnancy, another ordeal, all for their ambitions. Her daughter's soft cries pulled her back from the spiraling thoughts. Margary looked down at the baby in Aelari's arms and felt a swell of emotion. The child had beautiful brown eyes, wide and curious, and tufts of silky brown hair already beginning to curl at her temples. She was perfect, and for a moment, the shadow of her worries receded. But the reprieve was brief. The next wave of contractions tore through Margary's body with a force that left her gasping. It was as though her body had only paused to let her glimpse her daughter before reminding her there was still another life waiting to be brought into the world. "The second one is coming," the midwife announced urgently, already preparing for the next delivery. Margary clenched her teeth, her fingers digging into the linens beneath her. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but she knew she couldn't falter now. Drawing on every last ounce of strength, she pushed again, tears streaming down her face from the sheer effort. "You're almost there, my love," Aelari whispered, her voice steady and soothing. Olenna stood nearby, her sharp gaze unwavering, her presence an anchor in the chaos. With one final, desperate push, Margary felt the pressure release, and a second cry filled the room, a sound as sharp and piercing as a bell cutting through the haze of exhaustion. "It's a boy, Your Grace," the midwife announced, her voice ringing with triumph as she held the squalling infant aloft for all to see. Olenna Tyrell stepped forward with her characteristic authority, her sharp gaze sweeping the room before fixing on a nearby servant. "Fetch the king," she ordered briskly. The servant hesitated only for a moment before hurrying out of the chamber, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. A sob of relief broke from Margary's lips as she collapsed back against the pillows, her chest heaving with exertion. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks, and she made no effort to wipe them away. It was over. The pain, the fear, the endless months of anticipation, all of it had culminated in this moment. Her son was here. Her daughter was safe. The weight of her duty, her responsibility to the crown, to her house, and to herself, had been fulfilled. As the midwife carefully cleaned the infant and wrapped him in soft linens, Aelari placed a reassuring hand on Margary's shoulder, her face etched with a rare, tender pride. Olenna, though more reserved, allowed a small smile to touch her lips as she watched the scene unfold. "You've done it, my dear," Olenna murmured. "You've given them their heir and a princess. Let them try to find fault now." Margary barely heard her grandmother's words. Her focus was entirely on the tiny, wriggling bundle the midwife was bringing to her. The boy's cries were strong and insistent, filling the room with life and vigor. When the midwife finally placed him in Margary's arms, she gazed down at his scrunched-up face, his little fists waving in the air. A fresh wave of emotion washed over her. He was perfect, she thought as she gently stroked his yellow-gold hair. The chamber doors burst open with a resounding crash, and Tommen rushed in, his golden hair disheveled and his face flushed with both anxiety and excitement. Behind him, Cersei followed, her pace brisk but controlled, her sharp eyes scanning the room as if assessing the situation for any danger. Olenna Tyrell turned to face them, her expression calm and composed. "You have a son and a daughter, Your Grace," she announced, her voice cutting through the noise like the toll of a bell. "A son." Tommen repeated breathlessly, his wide eyes darting to Margary, who was cradling the newborn boy in her arms. His steps quickened as he crossed the room to her side, the nervous energy radiating off him in waves. Margary's gaze softened as she looked up at her husband. Exhaustion was written all over her face, but there was a warmth there, too, a flicker of pride and reassurance meant just for him. Without a word, she adjusted the baby in her arms, gently offering the small, swaddled bundle to him. Tommen hesitated for a moment, his hands hovering in the air as if afraid he might somehow break the delicate infant. "Go on," Margary encouraged, her voice barely above a whisper, worn from the ordeal of labor but still filled with tenderness. Slowly, Tommen reached out and took the child from her, cradling him as if he were the most precious treasure in the world. The boy stirred in his arms, letting out a tiny whimper before settling against his father's chest. Tommen's lips parted, and his expression shifted from awe to pure, unfiltered joy. "He's so small," he murmured, his voice trembling slightly. His gaze flicked to Margaery, a mix of wonder and gratitude in his eyes. "Thank you." Behind him, Cersei stepped closer, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as she regarded her grandson with a gleam of satisfaction. "A prince of the realm," she said, her tone measured, though the pride in her voice was unmistakable. Her eyes briefly met Margaery's, and for a fleeting moment, there was something almost like approval there, though it was quickly overshadowed by the sharp, calculating glint that never truly left Cersei's gaze. "And a princess," Olenna added pointedly, motioning toward the other babe, who was carefully being held by Aeleri. Cersei's attention snapped to the second infant, her expression softening as she approached. Aeleri handed the baby to her, and for a moment, Cersei was silent, gazing down at her granddaughter with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Tommen, still holding his son, glanced at his mother. "Mother," he asked tentatively, as though afraid to disrupt whatever moment she was having. "She has Margaery's eyes," Cersei said finally, her voice quieter than usual, almost wistful. She looked at Tommen, then Margaery, and her mouth curved into a faint smile. Margaery watched the scene unfold, her heart heavy with exhaustion but full nonetheless. She leaned back against the pillows, her hand resting on her chest as she took in the sight of her family. Whatever trials lay ahead, whatever games Cersei or others might play, this moment was hers. For now, there was peace. As Tommen turned back to her, their son still cradled protectively in his arms, he leaned down and kissed her gently on the forehead. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "For them. For everything." Margaery managed a tired but radiant smile, her exhaustion momentarily eclipsed by the warmth in her voice. "They're ours, Tommen. All ours." Tommen's free hand found hers, squeezing gently as if anchoring himself in this moment. Before he could speak, Aeleri stepped forward, her voice soft yet inquisitive. "What would you like to name them, Your Grace?" Tommen hesitated, his gaze flickering between his wife, his son, and his mother. "March," he began, but Cersei, standing nearby with the baby girl nestled in her arms, cut him off smoothly. "How about Tyar and Tyland?" she suggested, her tone dripping with maternal pride. "Strong names, rich with history. Tyland was a master of coin, and Tyar, well, a true lady of Lannister blood. Perfect for these royal children." Tommen frowned, his expression tightening as he glanced at his mother. "Those are Lannister names, Mother," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "And these children aren't Lannisters. They're Baratheons." Cersei's eyes narrowed slightly, but she quickly masked her irritation with a tight smile. "Of course, my sweet boy," she said, her tone saccharine. "But it never hurts to honor the legacy of their family, on all sides." Margaery shifted slightly, her hand reaching toward the swaddled infant in Cersei's arms. "Perhaps," she began, her voice calm and measured, "these children should represent a new beginning for House Baratheon." Tommen turned back to her, his expression softening as he nodded. "You're right," he said. "What do you suggest?" Margaery glanced at the two children, her tired gaze lingering on each of them in turn. "Argella and Orys," she said finally, her voice steady with conviction. "Argella Durrandon, the daughter of the last Storm King, and Orys Baratheon, the founder of our house. Names that carry strength and history, but also a sense of renewal. These children are a new beginning for us, Your Grace, for House Baratheon and for the realm." Tommen's face lit up, a smile breaking through his earlier tension. "Argella and Orys," he repeated, testing the names as if tasting something sweet. He looked at his son, then at his daughter in his mother's arms. "They're perfect." Olenna Tyrell, standing quietly to the side, nodded approvingly. "Wise choices, Your Grace," she said, her tone neutral but her eyes glinting with rare pride. Cersei's lips pressed into a thin line, though she said nothing. Her grip on the baby girl tightened ever so slightly before she relented, stepping forward to place Argella in Margaery's arms. "Argella," Cersei repeated, her voice low and careful. "A princess name. Fitting." Tommen moved closer, laying their son gently beside Margaery. "And Orys," he added, his hand resting lightly on the infant boy's head. "A true Baratheon. Strong and steadfast." As they sat together, Their newborn children nestled between them, a rare sense of unity filled the chamber. Margaery leaned her head against Tommen's shoulder, her heart swelling with hope despite the ever-looming shadows that hung over their lives. For now, they had this moment, a new beginning, a new family, and perhaps, a chance to reshape the future. _________________. 3 days had passed since the birth of her children, and Margaery finally felt strong enough to leave her chambers. Tommen, ever patient, had insisted on waiting for her recovery before making the formal announcement at court. Today, the time had come. Her handmaidens fussed over her as they prepared her attire, lacing her into a flowing golden gown that shimmered softly in the light. Before her confinement, Margaery had meticulously overseen the complete overhaul of her wardrobe, instructing the dressmakers to replace her red garments with shades of yellow and gold, the colors of House Baratheon. She had even commissioned matching ensembles for Tommen. Crimson was to fade away, and the true royal colors would once again emerge. As they adjusted her gown, Margaery smoothed the fabric over her hips and glanced at her reflection. Gold suited her, regal and luminous. She would never again wear Lannister red. Now that the twins were born, the time had come to implement her vision for the crown. In the nursery, Tommen had dressed in a golden doublet adorned with the Baratheon stag, its antlers embroidered in black thread. Margaery felt a swell of pride as she saw him cradling their son, Orys, while a nursemaid held their daughter, Argella. They were a family united, and Margaery was determined to solidify their legacy. The banners lining the Red Keep would be next. For years, the sigils displayed had been a compromise, a Lannister lion and a Baratheon stag split down the middle. Margaery had already begun plans to replace them with ones that bore only the stag. House Lannister had its place, but it had never been the royal house, and it was time that the realm knew that. Her intentions extended beyond aesthetics. Tommen had to be seen as a Baratheon king, no compromise, no duality. The rumors surrounding her husband's parentage had died down in the years since his brother's death, but Margaery knew whispers could once again grow into roars. Those whispers would not be allowed to touch her children. They were Baratheons through and through, and the court would see it too, one golden stag at a time. As she approached Tommen, she brushed her hand over his arm. "You look every bit the king, my love," she said softly, earning a shy smile from him. "Are you sure you're well enough for this?" Tommen asked, his young face creased with worry as he stood beside Margaery in their chambers. Margaery offered him a tired but genuine smile. "I'm fine, truly," she assured him, resting a hand on his arm. "Today is important, for you, for us, for our family." Tommen hesitated, then returned her smile, a flicker of determination sparking in his gaze. "I've been thinking, my love," she began, "about how we should be announced today at court. I think." Tommen's eyes sparkled knowingly as he interrupted her. "I know what you're going to say," he said, his voice soft. "And I agree. The realm should know us as Baratheon, as a family united under one name." Relief washed over Margaery's face, and she nodded. "I've already told the announcer," he admitted, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mother won't be happy, so let's not tell her until it's too late." Margaery chuckled softly, feeling a wave of pride in her husband. Maybe, just maybe, there was more steel in him than she'd dared to hope. "You're learning to play the game," she teased gently. Tommen laughed nervously but grew serious as he took her hands in his. "I've been thinking a lot these past few days," he confessed, his gaze steady now. "The children, they've made me think about who I want to be. What kind of father? What kind of king? And what kind of king do you want to be?" Margaery asked, her voice laced with curiosity and a touch of challenge. "A better one," Tommen said firmly, surprising her with the conviction in his tone. "I want to be more present, more involved. I don't want to just wave at the crowds while mother and grandfather rule the realm. When grandfather returns, I've decided I'm sending him and mother back to Casterly Rock. It's high time they went home." Margaery's heart leapt at his words, though she forced herself to remain composed. "You mean it?" she asked, needing to hear the certainty in his voice again. "Yes," Tommen said with a resolute nod. "It's my time to rule. When Tywin is gone, I want your brother, Willers, to be my hand of the king. He's smart, loyal, and he understands the kind of realm I want to build." "And your council?" Margaery prompted, sensing he had more to say. Tommen's lips curved into a shy, almost hesitant smile. "I want a fresh start," he said quietly, his voice laced with determination, though his tone softened with the weight of his thoughts. "Men I can trust. People who aren't driven by ambition, men who will stand with me for the right reasons." He paused, his gaze flickering briefly toward Margaery before continuing. "Maybe Tristan would stay if I offered him a seat on the council. And other lords, younger ones, men who haven't been corrupted by the games of power." He turned to her fully now, his expression sincere and open. "But most of all, I want you," he said, his words carrying a depth of emotion that reached beyond mere duty. "You are wiser than most people I know. You understand the realm, and you understand me. So, I think the Queen should have a seat on the council. We'll rule together, make decisions together, and not as separate halves, but as one." Tommen's grip tightened on her hand as he spoke, the seriousness of his tone undeniable. "I want to build a realm, a kingdom, that our children will be proud of. A realm that's just and peaceful, where the people don't fear their king, but love him. Where they know we are here to serve them, to make this a better place for all." Margaery's breath hitched, emotion swelling in her chest. She had spent so much time nurturing Tommen's growth, encouraging him to think beyond his mother's shadow, and now she saw the results standing before her. He wasn't just speaking as her husband but as her king. "You have no idea how happy that makes me, Your Grace," she said warmly, her voice trembling slightly with the weight of her emotions. Tommen leaned in, pressing a delicate but loving kiss to her lips. Margaery kissed him back, a deep sense of hope blooming in her heart. She could see it now, the boy she'd married was gone, replaced by a man, a father, and a ruler in his own right. All that remained was for him to follow through. "Let's keep this between us for now," Tommen said after a moment, pulling back just enough to meet her gaze. "I don't want to give Mother a chance to challenge me or sow discord before I've had time to act." "Of course, Your Grace," Margaery replied, the hint of a smile tugging at her lips. She was already thinking of how to help him solidify his plans, to ensure Tywin and Cersea's departure was swift and decisive. "Thank you, Margaery," Tommen said softly, his sincerity touching her deeply. "No," she said, her voice firm yet tender. "Thank you, Tommen. For trusting me. For stepping into the role you were always meant to have." As they prepared to step out together and announce the birth of their children to the court, Margaery couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. The days ahead would be fraught with challenges, but for the first time, she truly believed that she and Tommen could face them as equals, partners in life, in rule, and in shaping a legacy worthy of their children. As they walked through the gilded halls of the Red Keep, each cradling one of their newborn children, Margaery felt a rare and genuine sense of contentment. For the first time in weeks, months, years, perhaps, things seemed to be falling into place. Tommen held their son with a careful yet protective grip, his face glowing with pride. Margaery, with their daughter in her arms, mirrored his joy, her golden gown flowing gracefully as they moved. Together, they truly looked like a family fit to rule. At the closed doors to the great hall, Cersei waited for them. Her sharp green eyes softened momentarily as her gaze fell on the twins, though Margaery noticed the flicker of calculation behind them. Despite her lingering unease around her mother-in-law, Margaery maintained her poised and serene expression. "Your Grace," Cersei said, dipping into a subtle curtsy toward Margaery, though her tone carried its usual air of superiority. She turned to Tommen, her demeanor instantly warmer as she pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Your Grace," she repeated. "Mother, I wanted to speak with you," Tommen said, his voice steady but kind. "Of course, Your Grace," Cersei replied, her expression curious but controlled. "I want you to oversee the twins' naming ceremony," Tommen said, glancing at Margaery briefly before returning his attention to his mother. "It will be an intimate celebration, nothing too grand, but I thought you could take the lead in organizing it." Cersei's lips twitched into a smile, a flicker of satisfaction lighting her features. "Of course," she said smoothly. "I would love to. It will be a beautiful occasion." "Good, I'm glad," Tommen said with a nod. "Now, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead into the hall. Margaery and I would like to enter as a family." Cersei's smile faltered slightly, though she recovered quickly. "Well, I thought I might enter with just the four of us," Mother Tommen said firmly, his tone polite but resolute. We'll see you soon. For a moment, Cersei looked as though she might argue, her lips parting, but she seemed to think better of it. Without another word, she turned and swept through the doors, her crimson and gold lion emblazoned gown trailing behind her. As the heavy doors closed behind her, Margaery turned to Tommen, her brow raised in quiet amusement. "That was bold, Your Grace." Tommen sighed, though there was a hint of a smile playing at his lips. "I hope you don't mind about the naming ceremony," he said, shifting their son slightly in his arms. "I just thought it would give her something to focus on, and keep her occupied. Out of your way, mostly." Margaery's smile softened, and she leaned in to press a gentle kiss to his cheek. "I don't mind at all, my king," she said warmly. "In fact, I think it's a clever idea. You're starting to manage her quite well." Tommen laughed lightly, though he still seemed a little nervous. "We'll see how long it lasts," he murmured, glancing down at their sleeping son. "It will last as long as you want it to," Margaery replied, her tone confident and reassuring. "You're the king, Tommen. And today, we show the realm that we're a family, united and strong." Tommen met her gaze, his youthful face filled with gratitude and a growing sense of determination. He nodded, and together, they turned toward the great doors, ready to make their entrance as the king, queen, and proud parents of the future of House Baratheon. The massive oak doors swung open with a resounding creak, and the herald's voice rang out across the cavernous great hall, commanding attention. King Tommen of House Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, Protector of the Realm, and Queen Margaery, Lady of the Seven Kingdoms. Tommen and Margaery stepped forward together, their newborn twins cradled in their arms, golden light streaming through the high windows and illuminating them like a divine tableau. Tommen, dressed in a resplendent black and gold tunic adorned with the crowned stag of House Baratheon, looked every inch the king he aspired to be. Margaery, radiant in her flowing golden gown, held their daughter close, her expression a perfect balance of serene poise and maternal warmth. The great hall was filled with the nobility of the realm, the sea of faces a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and lingering trepidation. Margaery's sharp eyes took in every detail, noting with satisfaction the presence of several lords from the Stormlands, men who had once thrown their allegiance behind Stannis or Renly in defiance of the crown. Now they stood with heads bowed in deference, ready to honor their young king and the new era he represented. At the forefront, their families were divided by the wide aisle, standing like sentinels on either side. On the right stood the Lannisters. Cersei, draped in regal crimson, held her head high, though her expression betrayed a flicker of discontent. Beside her stood Myrcella and Tristan, their infant daughter wiggling energetically in Myrcella's arms. Margaery noted the warmth with which Tristan supported his wife, a small reminder that alliances forged in love could hold steady amidst storms. On the left stood House Tyrell. Olenna, Margaery's indomitable grandmother, looked on with a sharp, assessing gaze, her cane held like a scepter. Beside her were Mace and Aeleri, their expressions a mix of pride and familial affection. Margaery's eldest brother, Willers, stood tall and dignified, his wife, Melaea Caswell, a vision of quiet grace at his side. Garlan, her second brother, stood nearby with his wife, Leonette Fossoe, and their son, a boy of 4 who clung to his mother's skirts, wide-eyed at the grandeur. And then there was Loras. The youngest Tyrell brother, now resplendent in the white armor of the Kingsguard, stood off to the side of the room. His position, both literal and figurative, was a bittersweet reminder of his sacrifices for their family. The once brash knight of flowers had been tempered by duty and hardship, his expression unreadable as his gaze flicked from Tommen to the twins. The room quieted as Tommen and Margaery reached the dais. The sound of their footsteps echoed against the stone walls, a drumbeat of unity and purpose. Margaery glanced at Tommen as they ascended, her voice soft but firm. "This is our moment, Your Grace. Let them see the strength of House Baratheon." Tommen's grip on his son tightened as he turned to face the assembled lords and ladies, a mixture of old allies and former foes, each awaiting his words. His heart pounded, but his resolve was strong. "Today is a historic day," he began, his voice steady, though the weight of the moment pressed heavily on him. "My wife, Queen Margaery, has given me the greatest gift a man could ever receive, 2 beautiful and healthy children." He looked down at his daughter, nestled in Margaery's arms, her tiny face serene in sleep, and then at his son, who lay securely in his his little fingers twitching with a life all his own. First, she gave me a daughter, the Princess Argella of House Baratheon, Tommen continued, pride swelling in his chest. He nodded toward the infant in Margaery's arms, letting the names ring through the hall. And then she gave me a son and heir, the Prince Ois Baratheon. His gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of the noble families of Westeros. Let these children be the heralds of a new day for House Baratheon. Tommen paused for a moment, his eyes hardening as he acknowledged the shadow of recent events, the blood still fresh on the ground. As many of you know, he said, his voice turning somber, a fortnight ago my uncle Stannis, the pretender to the throne, was struck down in battle by my grandfather and my uncle Jaime. Along with the deaths of the traitors Ned Stark and Jon Snow, this is the end of a bloody chapter. Let this be a signal of a new era of peace for my realm. Tommen reached for Margaery's hand, giving it a soft squeeze, a silent promise of their shared future. For our realm, he repeated, and the room seemed to exhale in unity. His heart fluttered with a mix of excitement and nervousness as he continued, to mark this new beginning, at our children's naming ceremony, we will be naming our son officially as the Prince of Dragonstone, heir to the Iron Throne, and your future king. Tommen took a deep breath, steadying himself. He glanced at Margaery, the love of his life, the mother of his children, the woman who had given him this chance at a fresh start, and smiled warmly at her. But before he could say more, a sudden movement from the crowd snapped him back to the present. A man dressed in black, his cloak ragged and torn, emerged from the shadows. He moved with speed and purpose, his eyes locked on the royal family. A gasp rose from the crowd as he surged forward, a dagger flashing from his sleeve. There's only one ruler of Dragonstone, the man shouted, his voice filled with venom and fanaticism. He lunged at Tommen, aiming for the king's heart. But before the dagger could reach its mark, Loras was there, his reflexes honed by years of training, his sword flashing in the air like lightning. He moved with the swiftness of a panther, disarming the assassin with a single stroke. The man crumpled to the floor, his body lifeless, blood pooling at Tommen's feet. Margaery flinched and stepped back, her eyes wide with alarm, but she kept her hold on their daughter, instinctively pulling her closer to her chest. Cersei, her face pale but composed, rushed up the stairs toward Tommen, her arms outstretched to take Ois from him. Tommen, shaken but resolute, knelt beside the dead man. His breath came in short gasps as he stared down at the would-be assassin, the air thick with tension. The room was silent, save for the echo of the man's final words, his last, defiant breath hanging in the air like a ghost. Long live Queen Daenerys. Tommen looked up at Margaery, her face a mask of concern, and for the first time, he allowed himself to show the weight of the burden now thrust upon him. This was no longer a matter of power, this was a matter of survival. The realm was divided, and their enemies were far from vanquished. But with Margaery by his side, with his children in his arms, Tommen knew that he would not falter. He would face the future with strength, with his family, and with the will to protect them all. For the first time since his coronation, Tommen felt the true weight of his title. And he would bear it, for them. Notes. /n, hi all. Quick note, yes, I know all babies have blue eyes when they are born, but this is a world with dragons, so. Also, I really enjoyed writing this chapter, and it really makes me want to write a much shorter, fluffy fic of Tommen and Margaery ruling Westeros after I'm finished with this fic, which isn't miles away, so let me know if you would be interested in that. Chapter 63, Bran I. Chapter text. Bran I. How do we get in? Meera asked, her voice heavy with exhaustion as she dropped the reins of the sleigh. Her arms ached from days of pulling Bran along through the relentless snow, her breaths clouding in the bitter northern air. We not, Bran replied in the calm, matter-of-fact tone that had become second nature to him. His expression betrayed no uncertainty, no hesitation, as if the answer had always been obvious. Meera sighed, brushing a strand of her wind-blown hair from her face. After 6 years together, she knew better than to question him when he spoke like this. He saw things she couldn't, knew things he could never fully explain. Bran was no longer the boy who had fallen from a tower and been carried across Westeros on Hodor's back. At 18, he was handsome in a way that felt almost tragic. His dark hair, now grown to his jaw, was unevenly cut, something Meera only bothered to trim when it started obscuring his vision. A faint dusting of stubble lined his sharp jaw. If fate had been kinder, he might have been a knight, galloping on horseback through the streets of a town while girls turned their heads to admire him. But in this life, he was a cripple, bound to a sleigh and reliant on the strength and kindness of others to carry him where he needed to go. Moira, now a woman of 21, was no longer the girl who had left Greywater Watch with her brother to guard Bran. Years of hardship and survival had etched their marks on her, shaping her into someone fierce, resilient, and capable. Her once short curls had grown long and wild, though she often kept them braided and tucked away under layers of fur. She hadn't cut it since the day Bran had idly remarked that it suited her longer. Beneath the heavy furs, she bore the body of a woman, though her life left little time for vanity or indulgence. Despite everything they had endured, there were moments when she still felt like the girl who had set out from her home with a spear in hand, following the orders of her father. In some ways, they were both trapped in time, frozen like the North itself. It was as if the years spent in hiding had preserved a part of their youth, even as the world around them moved on. As they approached the towering gates of Castle Black, the wall loomed above them, an icy fortress that seemed more like a barrier between worlds than a simple structure. Its sheer size made Moira's stomach twist with unease. They had seen so much death, endured so much pain, and yet here they were, on the edge of the world, still searching for safety, or perhaps, purpose. Moira hesitated. "What if they don't let us in?" "They will," Bran said, his tone unshakable. His eyes, those haunted, ancient eyes that seemed far older than his years, fixed on the gate. Moira stepped forward, pounding on the gate with the hilt of her spear. The sound echoed like thunder in the icy stillness, and for a moment, there was no response. Then, the sound of heavy locks being undone filled the air, and the gate creaked open just enough for a wary face to peer through. A man in black armor, his weathered face shadowed by a hood, studied them cautiously. "Who goes there?" "Bran Stark," Bran said simply, his voice steady and commanding despite his fragile appearance. "And Moira Reed?" The man's eyes widened at the name, and his gaze shifted to Bran, lingering for a moment on the stark features that marked his lineage. Then he nodded, stepping aside to let them in. As the gates groaned open, Moira pulled the sleigh forward, her legs trembling with effort but her determination unshaken. Bran sat silently, his expression calm but unreadable, his eyes scanning the courtyard as if he were seeing more than what lay before him. Inside the wall, the chill was no less biting, but there was a strange sense of relief in being surrounded by stone and men, a reprieve from the endless emptiness of the wilderness. A few brothers of the Night's Watch gathered to stare at the newcomers, their faces a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "Welcome to Castle Black," the gatekeeper said gruffly, though there was a note of respect in his tone. "The Lord Commander will want to see you." Moira glanced at Bran, her expression guarded. "You didn't mention this part." "I didn't need to," Bran replied, his voice distant. "Everything is already in motion." Moira's heart sank at his cryptic words, but she said nothing. She simply adjusted her grip on the reins and followed the black-cloaked man into the shadowy halls of Castle Black. Behind her, Bran's gaze lingered on the wall, his thoughts already far beyond its icy expanse, where visions of fire and blood flickered at the edges of his mind. The great hall of Castle Black was a shadow of its former self. The once sturdy walls seemed to sag under the weight of neglect, and the cold air seeped in through cracks that had gone untended. Only a handful of the Night's Watch remained, their black cloaks faded and their faces etched with exhaustion. This was not the bastion of strength Bran had imagined in his youth, it was a skeleton of what it had once been. Bran and Moira entered slowly, their presence drawing the attention of the men gathered near the hearth. At the head of the room sat a young man, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression skeptical and guarded. Beside him stood an older man with a grizzled beard, his posture stiff and his eyes sharp. "You say you're Bran Stark," the younger man said, his tone laced with doubt. "He is Bran Stark," Moira replied firmly, stepping forward as if to shield Bran from the accusation. Her spear was still slung across her back, but the tension in her stance made it clear she was ready to defend him if needed. The man leaned forward in his chair, his gaze narrowing. "Bran Stark is dead." Moira's lips pressed into a thin line, but she said nothing. Bran, seated in the sled behind her, remained silent, his expression unreadable. The younger man rose from his chair. "My name is Gendry," he said, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. "I'm the acting Lord Commander of what's left of the Night's Watch." Mira's brows furrowed at his words. I thought Jon Snow was Lord Commander. At the mention of Jon's name, Gendry stiffened. Jon Snow is dead, he said flatly, in unison with Bran. Gendry's eyes widened, disbelief flickering across his face. He stepped closer to Bran, his broad frame casting a shadow over the sled. The young man's expression was guarded but searching, as though trying to unearth some hidden truth in Bran's pale, drawn face. His voice, when he finally spoke, was hoarse with suspicion. How do you know that? Bran met Gendry's gaze steadily, his blue eyes calm but distant, as though he were looking beyond the present moment. I see things, he said, his tone soft but resolute, each word weighted with certainty. I see your past, your choices, your fears, and your future. Gendry's brow furrowed, his skepticism deepening, but Bran continued before he could interrupt. I see you, Bran said, his voice taking on a quiet intensity. A smith's apprentice in King's Landing, working the forge, dreaming of a life you didn't think you'd ever have. I see your father, Robert Baratheon, dead before you even knew him. I see the Lannister soldiers coming for you, to kill you for your bloodline, and I see your master hiding you, sending you north to the wall. Gendry's breath hitched, but Bran's voice remained steady, unyielding. I see you with my brother Jon, standing atop the wall, staring into the endless snow, unsure of what lay beyond. I see you with my sister Arya, in the courtyard in Winterfell, fighting the connection you have with her. I see you at Hardham, wielding your hammer against the dead, your arms aching but your resolve unbroken. Bran's tone softened slightly, tinged with something almost like regret. I see you here, defending the wall against the Lannisters. I see Jon, naming you as his choice to lead the Night's Watch after him. And I see you watching him die, powerless to stop it. The hall fell into a heavy silence, the weight of Bran's words pressing down on everyone present. Gendry stared at Bran, his face a mixture of shock and something else, pain, perhaps, or anger at hearing his memories spoken aloud by a boy who couldn't have possibly been there. That's enough, Gendry said, his voice tight, but there was no venom in his words. He took a step back, running a hand through his dark, unruly hair. His mind reeled as he tried to process what he had just heard. It wasn't just the details Bran knew, it was the way he spoke them, with a certainty that left no room for doubt. How? Gendry demanded, his voice breaking slightly. How do you know all of that? No one else could. Bran's steady gaze didn't falter, his voice calm but laden with authority. I told you, he said simply, his tone carrying a weight far beyond his years. I see things. Not just the past, but the present and the future. I see the threads that connect us all, the choices that bind us and the paths we walk. I see what has been and what will be. His voice dropped lower, a chilling edge creeping in. And I see what is coming. The dead, the older man said grimly, his weathered face hardening. Yes, Bran confirmed. His eyes flickered to Davos. You're Davos Seawow. I know who I am. Davos cut him off sharply, his tone brusque but not unkind. I don't need you to tell me my whole life's tale, boy. But if you are who you say you are, how in the seven hells are you still alive? Bran's expression darkened, a flicker of sorrow crossing his face before he spoke. We ran, he said, his voice quieter now, heavy with the weight of memory. When Theon took Winterfell, there was chaos. One night, we had a chance to escape, and we took it, me, my brother Rickon, and our servants, Osha and Hodder. The plan was to head south, to reach Riverrun. Our uncle Edmure could have helped us if we got there. But we never made it. Bran paused, his hands clenching slightly on the edges of the sleigh as the memories surged. Mira moved a step closer, her presence a steadying force beside him. We were deep in the wilderness, somewhere near the Wolf's Wood. That's when they found us, a group of bandits. Deserters from some army, I think. They didn't care who we were. They wanted to rob us, but we had nothing. No gold, no food, nothing of value. His voice trembled slightly. Rickon, he was just a boy. They didn't care. They killed him. The room fell silent, the weight of Bran's words pressing down on everyone. Even Davos, who had seen horrors beyond count, looked away, his jaw tightening. Bran's gaze dropped to his hands as he continued. Osha tried to save him, but there were too many of them. She died protecting us. And Shagidog, Rakan's direwolf. They killed him too, just to sell his pelt. Moira placed a hand on Bran's shoulder, her face pale but resolute. Bran's voice grew steadier, though his words cut like a blade. They turned on me next. I couldn't run. I couldn't fight. They dragged me from Hodda's arms and were ready to kill me too. That's when Moira and her brother, Hojan, found us. They killed the bandits and saved me. Darvoz's gaze shifted to Moira, his expression a mix of respect and sorrow. Sounds like you've been through more than most, he said, his voice rough but sincere. Bran gave a slight nod, his expression somber, his gaze distant as if seeing something far beyond the confines of the Great Hall. After that, Hojan told me I had a greater purpose, he began. He said I was meant to find the three-eyed raven beyond the wall. So, we went north, into the lands of endless winter. It was harsh, cruel, but that's where we stayed. For years. Training, hiding, surviving. 5 years, Moira interjected, her voice heavy with memory. We lived with him, Brynden Rivers. At the mention of the name, Darvoz let out a short, incredulous laugh. Now I know this is a jest, he said, shaking his head. Brynden Rivers is long dead. Who's Brynden Rivers? Gendry asked, his brow furrowed in confusion. A Targaryen bastard, Darvoz replied, his tone laden with skepticism. One who lived about 100 years ago. He was the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch before my grandfather was born. Time works differently for people like him, Bran said, his voice quiet but firm. His gaze lifted to meet Darvoz. People like me. Darvoz frowned, his skepticism fading into a mix of unease and curiosity. And what exactly does that mean? The three-eyed raven, Bran explained, his voice as calm and detached as if he were reciting a lesson. It's not just a man. It's a force of nature, like the wind, the rain, or the snow. It's something that passes from person to person, growing stronger with each new host. For a time, it was Brynden Rivers, but now. It's him, Moira finished, her voice steady despite the weight of her words. Now it's Bran. Bran inclined his head slightly, his face shadowed with an eerie mix of wisdom and sorrow. I am the three-eyed raven, he said. Brynden prepared me for this, though I didn't fully understand it then. He taught me how to see, not just the past, but the threads that bind all things, the connections between people, between events. He taught me to look beyond time itself. Darvoz crossed his arms, his expression heavy with skepticism and unease. And what happened to him, this Brynden Rivers? His voice was gruff, his narrowed eyes fixed on Bran. The dead came, Bran replied, his voice calm, almost detached. The same ones who are coming for all of us. We lost them all, Brynden, Hodda, even my direwolf Summer. Only Moira and I made it out alive. Gendry, standing nearby, lowered his head slightly, his brows furrowed in thought. Then, as though sensing the weight behind Bran's words, he looked back up. And Hojan, he asked softly, his tone lacking its usual bluntness. Moira's lips tightened, and her complexion turned pale, her eyes shadowed with painful memories. He gave himself, Bran said, his words measured but heavy. That's all you need to know. No, Gendry said sharply, stepping forward. You don't get to walk in here, start talking about three-eyed ravens, magic, and claim to be people who've been dead for years, and then keep secrets. Not if you expect us to trust you. His voice was firm, though not without sympathy. Bran's expression didn't change, but his tone softened, tinged with sorrow. Hojan was a greenseer, he explained. It means he had visions, like I do, though his abilities were different. Limited, compared to mine. But when we reached Brynden, it was clear he wasn't fully. Moira took over, her voice hardening as her emotions rose to the surface. He wasn't a person anymore, she said bitterly, her hands curling into fists. Brynden Rivers was a creature, more magic than man. He claimed Bran needed more power to fulfill his purpose. And to do that, he sacrificed Hojan. What do you mean, sacrificed? Darvoz asked, his grizzled face tightening with disbelief. Moira's voice grew quieter, but no less furious. He killed Hojan, she said, her words sharp and bitter, and fed him to Bran. He said it was the only way for Bran to become what he needed to be. That thing, made us believe it was the only way forward. Bran's gaze remained fixed on Gendry and Davos, his tone unflinching as he added, Brynden Rivers was a monster. But he wasn't entirely wrong. Gendry stared at the two of them, horrified. He fed him to you, he repeated, the words coming out almost in disbelief. Bran didn't flinch. What he did saved us, he said. Hojan knew what was going to happen. He accepted it. He believed in me. Without his sacrifice, I wouldn't be here. And none of us would have a chance against what's coming. The room fell into a strained silence. Gendry's jaw clenched as he struggled to process the story, while Davos's expression darkened, his distrust of magic and its consequences clearly etched on his face. Finally, Gendry broke the silence, shaking his head in a mix of anger and bewilderment. So what now, he asked. You're this, three-eyed raven. What exactly are you supposed to do? Bran straightened in his chair, his gaunt face calm but resolute. What I'm supposed to do is make sure the living survive what's coming. The dead are marching south, and they won't stop until every kingdom is ash. My role is to guide us, to help us find the only path where we survive. And what is that path? Davos asked, his voice gruff but tinged with curiosity. It begins with Jon Snow, Bran said, his voice steady. He's the one who can unite us, the one who can bring the living together to face the dead. But he's dead. That's why we need Melisandre. Davos's face darkened further at the mention of her name. The Red Woman. After everything she's done, you're putting your faith in her. She has a role to play, Bran replied. As do all of us. The Lord of Light brought her here for this moment. She's the only one who can bring him back. And if she doesn't? Gendry asked, his voice low. She will, Bran repeated, his tone unwavering, the weight of his words filling the cold, empty hall. Because she must. If she doesn't, we're all doomed. This is crazy, Gendry muttered, pacing in front of the hearth, his hands clenched into fists. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the tension in his features. And if I hadn't seen the White Walkers with my own eyes, I'd be throwing you out of this keep for spouting madness. But, he paused, his voice softening. Maybe, just maybe, you're telling the truth. Either way, you're not seeing the Red Woman tonight. You need food, and a good night's rest. Jon will still be dead in the morning. There isn't the time, Bran began, his voice urgent, but Gendry cut him off, stepping closer. You may be the three-eyed raven. You may even be Bran Stark, Gendry said, his voice low but firm. But I am the commander of this keep, and I won't have witches and green seers bringing men back from the dead in the middle of the night. His gaze shifted to Meera, softening slightly. We'll set you both up in chambers, and you're welcome to what little food we have. But this will wait until dawn. Meera stepped protectively in front of Bran. We stay together, she said firmly, her green eyes locking with Gendry's. Gendry hesitated, then inclined his head with a weary sigh. Whatever you wish, my lady, he replied. Without waiting for a response, he strode past them, his boots echoing against the stone floor as he exited the room. _________________________________________________________________________ They were escorted to a chamber by a tired steward, a man whose face bore the hollowed-out look of someone who had seen too much death. A princess stayed here a few weeks ago, he said gruffly as he opened the door. She's dead now. They're all dead. He said it matter-of-factly, as though it were a truth so universal it no longer carried weight. Bran and Meera exchanged a glance. They knew what that felt like. The room itself was small and humble. A narrow double bed was pushed against one wall, with a hearth in the corner and a worn dresser whose drawers creaked open reluctantly. The air smelled faintly of old wood and ash. Meera ran a hand over the bed frame, brushing away some of the dust. It's hardly home, but it'll do, she said quietly. After a pause, her voice softened, tinged with an ache she couldn't quite hide. You know, I don't even remember what Greywater Watch looks like anymore. I used to think of it every day, but now, she trailed off, staring into the hearth where a fire had been lit but did little to warm the room. I suppose you don't have that problem. You can see Winterfell whenever you like. Bran, who had been gazing at the ceiling as if lost in thought, shook his head slowly. I try not to, he admitted. His voice was low, almost a whisper. It hurts too much. And besides, we'll be there soon. Moira turned to look at him, the flickering firelight casting long shadows across his face. Is that where we're heading next? Once John is back. You know I can't say, Bran replied, his tone soft but firm. He had grown used to withholding pieces of the future, not out of cruelty, but because he didn't want Moira to live like he did, adrift in the vast, tangled web of past, present, and future. He wanted her to stay tethered to the present, to remain grounded in a way he no longer could. Maybe we'll live there, Moira suggested, her voice tentative. When all this is over. She hesitated, then continued, I'd like to go home at some point. Tell my father about Hojan. Her voice faltered briefly at her brother's name. Although I think he'll already know. Howland Reed. Bran knew the name well, knew the man even better in a way that Moira never could. Her father, a green seer, had passed the gift to Hojan but not to Moira. Over the years, she had spoken to Bran about the quiet isolation she had felt, the frustration of being the only one in her family without the sight. But for Bran, who bore the weight of knowing too much, the idea of that silence sounded like a mercy. You don't have to stay with me, Moira, Bran said after a long silence, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond the room, beyond even her. I'm safe now. I can get to Winterfell myself. You could go home. Moira turned sharply, her expression hardening. I can't leave you, she said, the words edged with defiance. I love, she stopped herself abruptly, her voice catching in her throat. The unfinished sentence lingered in the air, a truth they both knew but rarely spoke aloud. Bran's expression softened for a moment, but there was a sadness in his eyes. They had both felt the same for a long time. She had fallen in love with the boy he once was, the boy who had spun stories to help her fall asleep in the cold, who had made her laugh when the longing for home became unbearable. The boy who had kissed her for the first time under the northern sky, their breaths mingling in the icy air. But that boy was slipping away. Bran's powers had grown, and with them, so had the distance between the person he was and the person he had been. He could feel it, the steady erosion of his humanity, the way his memories of his old life felt like echoes in a vast and empty cavern. Moira had dreamed of a future where they could be together, a life in Greywater Watch where he could read and study while she hunted. She imagined the children they could have, children who would sit on Bran's lap as he told them tales of Westeros' long and storied history. But Bran didn't want that for her. He didn't want her future shackled to him, a man bound to a chair, a mind that was half his own and half something otherworldly. And besides, he had seen their future, and that wasn't what awaited them. You don't have to say it, Bran said finally, his voice almost too soft to hear. I know. Moira sat down on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumping. I just wish, she didn't finish the thought. There was no point. They both knew what she wished for the boy she loved to come back, for the future they had once dreamed of to somehow still be possible. Bran reached out, his hand brushing against hers. It was a small gesture, but it was enough to remind her that some part of him was still there. Whatever comes next, she said after a long pause, we'll face it together. Bran nodded, though he didn't meet her eyes. Together, he echoed. But even as he said it, he couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could hold on to her, and how much longer she would want to hold on to him. She helped Bran into the bed, her movements careful and practiced from years of supporting his weight. Once he was settled, she climbed in beside him, the fur blankets heavy over them both. Without a word, he pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her in a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. Moira pressed her face into his chest, seeking the warmth and solace she so desperately needed. The night was long and restless. Sleep came to her in fleeting snatches, only to be chased away by nightmares, visions of icy landscapes, dead eyes, and the faces of those she had lost. She would stir, trembling and afraid, and each time Bran would tighten his hold, his presence steady and unmoving. He rarely slept anymore, his mind too full of visions and whispers from realms she could never understand. Instead, he lay awake, gazing at the shadows flickering on the walls, listening to her breathing as it shifted between shallow gasps and the deep, even rhythm of temporary rest. He could do little to fight the demons in her dreams, but he could be there when she woke. If he couldn't be the boy she had once loved, the boy who made her laugh and chased her fears away, he could at least stay quiet, holding her as though nothing had changed. He let her pretend, for a few fleeting hours, that he was still him. That the world hadn't stolen the future they had imagined, leaving only this fragile, fractured moment in its place. Gendry led Bran and Meera down the narrow, dimly lit corridors of Castle Black, the cold stone walls bearing the scars of countless years of use. The air was heavy with dampness and the faint tang of iron, as though the very keep itself still remembered the blood spilled there. Bran was seated in an old, rickety wheelchair that Gendry had retrieved from storage, one that had once belonged to Maester Aemon in his final years when even walking had become too much for him. Meera walked beside the chair, her hand resting protectively on its arm, her gaze watchful as they moved deeper into the keep. The clatter of Gendry's boots echoed in the silence as they descended into the cells, a foreboding place that reeked of neglect and misery. He carried a torch, its flickering light casting long, eerie shadows along the stone walls. He stopped abruptly in front of an iron-barred door, his expression hardening. "We left her in here after the Lannisters marched out," Gendry said, his voice low and laced with disgust. "Tywin pardoned us all after Ned and Jon's execution. Said they still needed someone to keep the wildlings out. But I saw what she did, the princess. I saw her body. Whatever you think of the witch, you won't convince me she deserves to walk free. Not after that." Meera exchanged a wary glance with Bran, who remained silent, his expression unreadable. "Who is she?" Meera asked, her voice steady but edged with curiosity. "What did she do?" Gendry's jaw tightened, his knuckles white where they gripped the torch. "Melisandre," he spat, as though the name itself was poison. "The Red Woman. She came here preaching about gods and sacrifices, claiming she was acting on behalf of her so-called Lord of Light. She used the princess, Stannis' daughter, Shireen. Said her death would win the war against the Lannisters. Burned her alive in front of her own father." Meera inhaled sharply, her face pale in the torchlight. "And Stannis allowed this?" "He didn't just allow it, he ordered it," Gendry said bitterly. "But it didn't matter. It didn't save him. The Lannisters crushed him, and his men. He died a traitor, and the princess died for nothing." He gestured toward the cell door. "After that, we locked Melisandre away. There's no justice I can give her myself, but I'll be damned if I let her walk free." Bran's eyes, pale and distant, seemed to bore into the darkness beyond the bars. "She has a role yet to play," he murmured, his voice eerily calm. Gendry spun around, his face dark with anger and disbelief. "And what role would that be? More death? More innocent blood spilled in the name of her fire god?" His voice grew harsher, trembling with old wounds. "She wanted me next, you know. Said my blood was special, royal. Maybe she'd still try if she had the chance." Bran remained silent, his expression distant and unreadable as they walked through the dim corridor, their footsteps echoing against the cold stone. The only sound besides their movements was the faint crackle of the torchlight. Finally, they reached the cell. Inside, a woman sat hunched on a small cot, her fiery red hair unkempt and tangled, her once elegant crimson dress tattered and stained. The walls of the cell were covered in chaotic markings, lines, symbols, and words etched with what seemed like desperate fervor. They twisted and overlapped, forming a maddening tapestry of incomprehensible scrolls. Without looking up, the woman spoke in a calm, haunting voice. "I've been expecting you, Bran Stark." Meera tightened her grip on Bran's arm, her wary eyes darting between Bran and the woman in the cell. Gendry, standing stiffly at Bran's side, scowled. "You can talk to her if you must," he muttered, his voice heavy with mistrust, "but know this, she's not going anywhere. That's final." He handed the torch to Meera, his jaw clenched, and turned on his heel, his boots echoing as he walked away. Bran's eyes remained fixed on Melisandre as the air between them seemed to grow heavy with unspoken truths. "You've seen me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, though there was no doubt in his tone. "In the flames," Melisandre replied, her voice distant, almost dreamlike. She stared into the dim space around them, her thoughts drifting somewhere far beyond the confines of the cell. "I saw a raven fall to the ground, its wings clipped, broken. But then another raven took flight, soaring high, far across the skies. It flew for what felt like a lifetime, and then, it landed in my lap. Bran took in the words slowly, the meaning behind them not lost on him. He had seen the same vision in his dreams, a raven falling, the beginning of something new, something far more significant than any one person. "Do you know where you went wrong?" Bran asked, his gaze unwavering. Melisandre met his eyes then, and for the first time, something close to regret flickered in the depths of her fiery gaze. She nodded solemnly, the weight of years of mistakes pressing upon her. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with the weight of her admissions. "Stannis wasn't the chosen one. But, he had his part to play. He needed to lead them here." Bran nodded, his expression unreadable. "You weren't wrong, not entirely," he said quietly. "Your visions misled you, yes. But they served a purpose." His voice dropped slightly, as if to share a truth that had always been just beneath the surface. "You had to believe. Only then could he believe. Only then would he follow you." Melisandre's lips parted, her brow furrowing slightly as she absorbed Bran's words. There was a flicker of something like understanding in her eyes, but it was gone before it could settle. She had always believed that the flames held the truth, that they guided her to her purpose. But Bran was speaking of something different, something deeper. "What do you see now?" he asked. "What do the flames say now?" She walked over to where Moira held the lit torch and looked deep into it. "I see snow," she said, her voice quiet, but her words carrying a weight that hung heavy in the air. "Rising from the ground, as though it's in reverse, as though time itself is bending. And then it falls, covering everything. Dragonstone. Winterfell. King's Landing. It spreads like a blanket, like a storm." "It's him, isn't it?" she asked softly, her voice heavy with the gravity of the realization she had reached. "Jon Snow." Bran's voice was calm, but there was an intensity beneath his words that seemed to resonate in the cold air of the cell. He gazed beyond Melisandre, his unseeing eyes appearing to pierce through time itself. "From the beginning, it's always been about him," he began, his voice low but filled with an undeniable certainty. "Aegon Targaryen crossing the narrow sea to claim Westeros, changing the course of history. Torrhen Stark, the king who knelt, surrendering the north without a fight, preserving his people for what was to come. Lyanna Stark, falling in love with Rhaegar Targaryen despite the chaos it unleashed. All of it, every moment, every choice, was to set the stage for him to exist." Melisandre's expression shifted, a flicker of unease crossing her face as she tried to comprehend the vastness of what Bran was saying. He continued, his voice growing steadier, as though each word solidified a truth he'd carried within him for years. "Since the day Jon Snow was born, the threads of fate have revolved around him. Every triumph, every tragedy, every sacrifice, it has all been leading to this moment, to him standing on the precipice of destiny. And everything, every death, every war, has been to ensure he would be here, now, when the world needs him most." Melisandre stepped closer to Bran, her eyes narrowing as she hung on to his every word. "And you believe this was all orchestrated? That every thread of history led to his birth, to his resurrection?" Bran nodded, his expression grave. "Yes. He was meant to be born of ice and fire, the bloodlines of Stark and Targaryen united to bring him into this world. Even the conflicts that tore our families apart, the rebellion that cost so many lives, it was all to place him on the board, ready for the moment he would be needed. And since that day, everything has been guiding him here, ensuring he would endure, ensuring he would rise again when the time was right." Moira, silent until now, cast a questioning look at Bran. "And now that he's here, what does it mean? What happens next?" Bran's gaze didn't waver, his voice soft but unwavering. "Now, he must be brought back. He must take his place, not just as Jon Snow, but as who he truly is. His path will be fraught with pain, with sacrifice, but he is the only one who can lead us through what is coming. He is the sword in the darkness, the shield that guards the realms of men. He is our hope, our light against the endless night." Melisandre's lips parted, her face a mixture of awe and fear. "If you are right," she whispered, "then every choice I've made, every failure, every mistake, it was all necessary, wasn't it? All to bring him to this moment." Bran's expression softened slightly, though his tone remained steady. "Yes. The flames showed you glimpses of the truth, but only enough to lead you to where you needed to be. You believed in Stannis because you had to, because he had his part to play. But now you see what the flames were truly pointing toward. Not the one who would clear the path, but the one who would walk it. Melisandre closed her eyes briefly, as though trying to absorb the weight of Bran's words. When she opened them, her gaze burned with a renewed purpose. Then we cannot waste any more time. The dawn must rise, and Jon Snow must be the one to bring it. __________. The group made their way through the shadowed halls of Castle Black, the torch in Moira's hand casting flickering light across the stone walls. Davos led the way, his expression grim and his words heavy with the weight of what they were about to see. We tried to burn the body, he began, his voice low and rough. We burned the others who fell that day, but not him. Every time we tried, the pyre wouldn't light, or the flames would extinguish themselves before they even touched him. After a while, we stopped trying. We brought him here, to the Maestas chambers. The door creaked open, and a wave of biting cold swept over them. Even in the perpetual chill of Castle Black, the air in the chamber was unnaturally frigid, like the depths of a winter storm. Bran felt the familiar sharpness of the cold against his skin, a chill that reminded him of the far north and the presence of the dead. The room itself was stark and barren, the only notable feature being the stone slab in the center where Jon Snow's body lay. It was an eerie sight. Jon looked as though he were merely asleep, his face serene, untouched by decay. The only visible mark of his death was the stitched line encircling his neck, where his head had been gruesomely reattached after his execution. Moira's voice broke the tense silence. "He's been dead for weeks," she asked, her breath visible in the frosty air. How did you stop him from decomposing?" Davos shook his head, his expression a mixture of disbelief and resignation. "We didn't," he said simply. Gendry, stepping into the room behind them, added, "We did nothing. He just stayed like this. No rot. No smell. Nothing. It's like time stopped for him." Bran moved closer to Jon's body, his wheelchair creaking faintly against the stone floor. His pale blue eyes focused on the still form of his brother. "It's the magic," Bran murmured. "The blood of the old gods and the new. Something is preserving him." Moira shivered, not just from the cold but from the unease creeping up her spine. "It doesn't feel right," she said softly. "It's like he's in between, neither here nor gone." Davos nodded, rubbing his arms against the chill. "That's what I've been saying. It's not natural, but then again, none of this is." Bran reached out a trembling hand, hesitating just above Jon's chest, where the faintest wisp of frost seemed to cling to his armor. "He's waiting," Bran said, his voice distant, as though he were speaking from another time or place. "The threads of his life are tangled, but they are not cut. He's tied to something larger." Melisandre stepped forward, her presence commanding despite her disheveled appearance. Gendry had brought her from her cell, her hands still bound in shackles. Her eyes flicked to Bran, her lips pressing into a thin line as though she understood what needed to be done. "The fire refused him," she said, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. "Because it was not his time to burn. The Lord of Light has plans for him." Bran nodded, lowering his hand. "It's time to bring him back. He doesn't belong to the darkness, not yet." Davos let out a long breath, glancing at Gendry. "You really think this is going to work? You think we can just bring him back?" Bran's gaze didn't waver. "I've seen it. He has a role to play, and this is not how his story ends." Gendry shook his head, his skepticism evident, but he didn't argue. The tension in the room was thick as they stood there, each of them feeling the weight of what was to come. Finally, Davos stepped back, gesturing to Melisandre. "Do what you need to do, but if he wakes up wrong, if he's not the man he was, we deal with it." "Agreed." Melisandre stood unwavering, her gaze locked on Jon's body. "Bring me water, fire, and salt," she commanded, her tone brooking no argument. Then, after a pause, she added, "and mud from the base of the weirwood tree." Davos exchanged a skeptical glance with Gendry, but neither protested. Instead, they dispersed, gathering the items as the witch had instructed. When they returned, their arms full of supplies, she was already arranging the room. The small chamber seemed to shrink as more candles were brought in, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows across the cold stone walls. Soon, the room was filled with a faint warmth, though the unnatural chill emanating from John's body lingered. Melisandre carefully prepared her tools, moving with the precision of someone performing a sacred rite. She took the mud, dark and rich with the essence of the weirwood, and began to mix it with water, creating a thick paste. With reverence, she scooped the mixture into her hands and approached John's body. "This mud comes from the roots of the old gods," she murmured, almost to herself. "I may not kneel to them, but I cannot deny their power. Their touch lingers in this place, in this boy, in the blood that runs through his veins. This will seal the wound, binding what was severed." She leaned over John's still form and began to apply the paste with deliberate care. Her movements were slow, almost tender, as she spread the mud across the line where his head had been crudely reattached to his neck. The suture marks disappeared beneath the thick coating, the dark mud contrasting sharply against his pale, lifeless skin. "It won't be perfect," Melisandre said softly, almost to herself. "There will be scars, there are always scars when one comes back. But it will hold. It must hold." Moira watched from the corner of the room, her fingers gripping the torch tightly. "You've done this before?" she asked, her voice tense. Melisandre didn't look up. "No," she said, "but I've seen it happen. When I was girl." She turned to Davos. "Salt and water," she said, holding out her hand. He hesitated for a moment before passing her the bowl of salt. She sprinkled it over John's chest, murmuring prayers in a language none of them understood. The cadence of her words was hypnotic, rising and falling like the ebb and flow of the sea. Next, she took the bowl of water and dipped her fingers in, letting droplets fall onto John's brow. "Water for the rivers of life," she whispered. "Salt for the tears shed for him. Fire to awaken the soul." At this, she gestured for Gendry to hand her the torch. With steady hands, she held the flame above John's heart, its heat radiating against his cold skin. The candlelight reflected in her eyes, making them seem to burn with their own inner fire. She knelt beside the slab, pressing her hands against John's chest. The room seemed to grow even colder, and the flames of the candles flickered wildly. Her voice rose in a chant, the words harsh and commanding, invoking the power of the Lord of Light. The mud on John's neck began to shimmer faintly, as though the weirwood's essence was responding to her call. The room grew still, the air thick with anticipation. Bran's gaze was fixed on John's body, his breathing shallow. Moira's grip on the torch tightened, and Davos crossed his arms, his expression a mixture of doubt and unease. Even Gendry, who had been the most skeptical of all, watched with bated breath. As the chanting reached its crescendo, Melisandre leaned forward and whispered something against John's ear, words none of them could hear. Then, she placed the torch back in the holder and pressed her palms firmly against his chest. For a moment, nothing happened. And then the candles flickered wildly, their flames shooting higher. A low, guttural sound escaped John's throat, his chest heaving as if he were gasping for air. His eyes flew open, dark and wild, and a sharp, ragged breath filled the room. Everyone froze. Jon Snow was alive. Chapter 64, Roslyn XXI. Chapter text. Roslyn XXI. It had taken Roslyn and Tyrion a full moon to travel south from Winterfell to Dragonstone, much of it spent on a swaying ship cutting through the choppy, unforgiving waters of the narrow sea. Each day on the boat felt endless, the endless horizon offering little in the way of comfort or distraction. Ravens brought sparse messages from the world they'd left behind, each scrap of news a reminder of how much they'd risked by setting out on this journey. The voyage was a trial in its own way. Roslyn, unused to life at sea, found herself battling queasiness and a deep sense of disquiet. Tyrion, on the other hand, seemed at home amid the creaking timbers and salt-laden air. He adapted easily to the rhythms of the ship, often seated on the deck with a cup of wine in one hand and a book or map in the other. Roslyn spent much of her time with him, drawn by his sharp wit and the ease with which he navigated the tension of their journey. They played games to pass the time, games of wit, wordplay, and strategy. Though Roslyn prided herself on her cleverness, she quickly realized that matching wits with Tyrion Lannister was no easy feat. He won more often than not, grinning smugly as he claimed victory, though he was gracious in encouraging her when she managed to best him. In the evenings, after the sun had set and the ship rocked gently in the dark waters, they would sit together near the captain's cabin, warmed by lantern light and the occasional bottle of wine. Tyrion always seemed to have one at hand, and though Roslyn tried her best to keep pace with him, she often had to set her cup aside long before he showed any signs of slowing. These quiet moments, softened by wine and the isolation of their journey, led to unguarded conversations. Tyrion spoke openly of his past, painting vivid, often painful pictures of his life under the shadow of Tywin Lannister. He recounted stories of his father's coldness, his sister's cruelty, and the cold childhood he had lived in Casterly Rock. "My birth was the death of my mother," Tyrion said one night, his voice unusually quiet as he stared out at the dark waves. "A debt my father never allowed me to forget. He carried her absence like a wound, and every time he looked at me, it was as if he were staring at the blade that had struck him." Roslyn listened intently, her heart aching at the vulnerability he rarely showed. "In that way, I think your father and mine are cut from the same cloth," she replied softly. "Walder Frey never saw me as his daughter, not really. I was just another pawn to be married off. My worth was measured by what I could bring to him, alliances, favors, power." Tyrion raised his cup in a silent toast. "To surviving fathers who would sooner see us tools than people. And to carving out lives of our own despite them." As they drank, Roslyn found herself opening up about her own struggles. She spoke of her son, Torren, the joy and fear he brought her in equal measure. She admitted the guilt she carried for being unable to give Robb another child, something she knew he desperately wanted even if he never pressed her about it. Tyrion's expression softened as he listened. "You know," he said after a moment, "if my father loved anything other than power, it was my mother. When she died, he became something else, cold and cruel, as though losing her carved out the heart of him. I think Robb would happily trade a dozen sons for a lifetime with you by his side. I doubt he's foolish enough to see you as anything but irreplaceable." Roslyn smiled at that, though a part of her still carried the weight of her self-imposed inadequacies. Tyrion's words, while comforting, didn't dispel the doubts entirely, but they did remind her of the strength she found in Robb's love for her and their son. One night, the ship rocked gently under a canopy of stars, and Roslyn and Tyrion sat on the deck with a bottle of wine nearly drained between them. The sea air was cool, carrying the faint scent of salt and wood. Both had drunk far too much, their cheeks flushed from the alcohol and the raw honesty it seemed to invite. Tyrion leaned back against a coil of rope, his expression uncharacteristically somber. His cup dangled loosely from his fingers as he stared out at the horizon. Roslyn could tell he was wrestling with something, the way his eyes flickered with indecision. Finally, he broke the silence. "I love her, you know." Roslyn blinked, startled by the sudden confession. For a moment, she thought she might have misheard him. "Sansa?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. He nodded, exhaling a breath that sounded more like a sigh. "Sansa," he repeated, as though saying her name aloud made it more real, more unbearable. "And I don't mean in the way you love her, like a sister, or a friend. I did once, at the beginning. Back then, she was just something to protect. Someone innocent and pure who deserved better than being shackled to a man like me." Roslyn tilted her head, watching him closely. His usual mask of wit and self-deprecation was gone, leaving behind something raw and vulnerable. "But now," she prompted softly. Tyrion hesitated, his gaze dropping to the wine swirling in his cup. "Now," he paused, his voice thick with emotion. "Now, she walks into a room and I can't breathe. I spend my days waiting, hoping, for the briefest moment when I might see her. Hear her voice. And it kills me because I know, deep down, I know, that if she had any other choice, she would leave me without a second thought. And why wouldn't she?" He laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "I'm her last resort, her prison. Not her choice." Roslyn's heart ached as she listened to Tyrion's words, each one weighted with self-loathing and doubt. His pain was palpable, etched into the lines of his face and the heaviness of his tone. She leaned forward, bridging the space between them, her hand brushing lightly against his. "Tyrion," she began softly, "Sansa has been through so much. More than anyone should ever have to endure. But you may not see what I see, you've been her anchor in a storm. And Daemon. You've been a father to him." Tyrion's lips quirked in a small, self-deprecating smile, but it faltered as his gaze dropped to his hands. I didn't know what to do when Daemon was born, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I was terrified. Scared he would grow into Joffrey, a monster beyond anyone's control, and that I would be powerless to stop it. Every time I held him, I wondered if that darkness was lurking in his blood, waiting for its moment. He exhaled shakily, his fingers tightening around his cup. But now I look at him, and that boy is the kindest, most compassionate person I have ever known. How, Roslyn? How can he be his son? Roslyn's chest tightened at the raw vulnerability in his voice. She reached out, cupping his hand with her own, her eyes meeting his with unwavering certainty. Because he's not his son, she said firmly. Not truly. Daemon is yours, Tyrion. Yours and Sansa's. Joffrey has nothing to do with him. Tyrion shook his head slightly, as if struggling to believe her words. But his blood. Blood doesn't make a father, Roslyn interrupted, her voice resolute. Love does. Patience. Kindness. All the things you've given Daemon, the things Joffrey never could have. Do you think Daemon learned to be kind from his blood? No, Tyrion. He learned it from you. From the way you treat him, the way you guide him, the way you protect him. Tyrion blinked, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. But Sansa. She will never forget who his father truly is. She's never spoken of it, but I see it in her eyes sometimes. The fear. The shadow of it. And yet, she trusts you with him, Roslyn pointed out. That should tell you everything you need to know. Sansa may carry that shadow, but she doesn't see it in Daemon. She sees you, Tyrion. She sees the man who raised her son to be better, to be good. He was silent for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over him. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, steadier. Sometimes, I think Daemon is the only good thing I've ever done. The only legacy I'll leave behind worth anything. Roslyn smiled, squeezing his hand. That's not true. You've done more good than you realize, Tyrion. For Daemon. For Sansa. Even for Robb and me, just by being here, by fighting for what's right. A faint, genuine smile tugged at Tyrion's lips, though his eyes still glistened with unshed tears. You're kinder to me than I deserve, Roslyn. Truly. And you're harder on yourself than you deserve, she countered gently. You're a better man than you give yourself credit for, Tyrion Lannister. And Daemon is proof of that. They sat in companionable silence for a time, the ship creaking gently beneath them and the stars shimmering overhead. Roslyn hoped, deep in her heart, that Tyrion would one day believe the truth of her words. Because in her eyes, he already was the kind of man he doubted he could ever be. As Dragonstone's dark silhouette loomed on the horizon, Roslyn felt her breath catch in her throat. The castle was unlike anything she had ever seen, its jagged black towers clawed at the sky like the talons of a great beast. Worn but imposing, the stone dragons perched along its parapets seemed almost alive, their snarling faces frozen in eternal defiance of the sea's fury. She gripped the railing of the ship's upper deck, her knuckles white as the vessel glided closer to the harbor. The salty tang of the air was thick here, mingled with the scent of charred wood and damp stone. Tyrion stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the approaching fortress, though his expression was far less awestruck. Magnificent, isn't it, he said, his tone light. Built with Valyrian skill, long before anyone on this continent could dream of such wonders. Roslyn nodded wordlessly, her gaze still fixed on the towers. Just as the ship began its final approach, a sound tore through the air, a deafening, blood-curdling roar that sent chills down her spine. She froze, her heart pounding, as a shadow swept over the deck. Above them, a creature unlike anything Roslyn had ever imagined soared through the sky. Its massive wings, creamy white with shimmering gold patterns, beat against the wind with an almost hypnotic rhythm. Its long, serpentine neck turned, and its gleaming eyes seemed to study the ship below with keen interest. Roslyn stumbled backward, instinctively ducking as the dragon passed low overhead. The wind from its wings buffeted the ship, rattling the masts and scattering loose ropes across the deck. Tyrion, however, remained unmoved, his hands clasped behind his back as he chuckled. "You'll get used to them," he said, casting a sidelong glance at her pale face. "I promise." Though Viserion does have a flair for the dramatic. Rosalind stared after the dragon as it disappeared toward the castle, its roar still echoing in her ears. "That's Viserion," she managed, her voice trembling. One of three Tyrion replied, a hint of pride in his tone. "Viserion, Rorigal, and Drogon. The children of our queen. Magnificent, aren't they?" Magnificent wasn't the word Rosalind would have chosen. Terrifying, or inspiring, and otherworldly seemed more fitting. As they approached the dock, she found herself glancing nervously toward the sky, half expecting another of the dragons to appear. "Do they always fly so low?" she asked, still shaken. "Only when they want to remind you who's really in charge," Tyrion said with a wry smile. "Daenerys may sit on a throne, but it's her dragons who truly rule the skies." Rosalind turned her attention back to the castle, its gates now visible as they drew closer. She squared her shoulders, determined to compose herself. She was here to represent her family and her people, to secure an alliance that might save them all. She couldn't afford to be intimidated, not by dragons, and not by the formidable woman who commanded them. But as the ship finally docked and the gangplank was lowered, Rosalind couldn't shake the lingering tremor in her hands. Whatever lay ahead in Dragonstone, it was unlike anything she had ever faced before. As Rosalind and Tyrion descended the gangplank onto the weathered stones of Dragonstone's harbor, they were greeted by a figure standing in the shadows of the towering fortress. The sea breeze tugged at his robes, the muted grey and black fabric swirling around him like smoke. Varys stepped forward, his face impassive but his eyes gleaming with the usual sharp intelligence. "Lady Stark." "Tyrion," he said smoothly, his voice carrying easily over the sound of waves lapping against the dock. "Welcome to Dragonstone." "Lord Varys," Rosalind replied, inclining her head respectfully. "It has been so long." "5 years, my Lady," Varys said with a faint smile. "When I last saw you, you were but a girl on the verge of motherhood. And now I hear you have a son, as strong as his father." "As stubborn as his father," Rosalind said with a small laugh, though her smile wavered briefly at the mention of Robb. Varys's gaze lingered on her for a moment, assessing. "Stubbornness is a virtue in these times," he said gently, before turning his attention to Tyrion. "And you, my lord, I trust the journey was not too arduous." "Arduous is an understatement," Tyrion replied with a snort, "but we survived, as always. Now, tell me, how fares our queen?" Varys's expression tightened ever so slightly. "She has grown even more impatient since you last saw her," he said. "She struggles to understand why she must wait when victory seems so close at hand." "Patience has never been one of Daenerys' strengths," Tyrion remarked, his tone dry but affectionate. "It's both her greatest flaw and her greatest asset." Rosalind's words faltered as movement drew her attention. At the far end of the dock, 3 figures emerged from the shadows of Dragonstone's formidable gates, their footsteps sharp against the cold stone that bordered the sea. They walked with purpose, each exuding an aura of authority, though their mannerisms differed greatly. At the forefront was a young woman with sun-kissed skin that glowed warmly in the afternoon light. Her dark hair was intricately braided, each strand adorned with delicate shells and beads that shimmered as she moved. There was a quiet determination in her stride, her steps precise, her posture regal despite the simplicity of her dress. She carried herself with the air of one accustomed to both diplomacy and resilience. Beside her walked a tall man with a lean, muscular frame. His salt-weathered features and the faint scars that marked his skin spoke of a life spent in battle. His stride was unhurried yet deliberate, as though each step was calculated. He wore a simple but well-crafted leather harness, his sword resting comfortably at his side. Though his demeanor was calm, there was an unmistakable intensity in his dark eyes, a readiness for action that seemed ever present. Trailing slightly behind them was an older man with a grizzled beard and hair streaked with silver. His armor, though slightly dulled with age, was meticulously maintained, each dent and scrape a badge of honor. His gaze swept over the group with quiet scrutiny, his steps measured and deliberate, as if every movement carried the weight of years of service and sacrifice. His bearing was that of a man who had stood before kings and queens and fought in battles long sung about in the halls of Westeros. Noticing Rosalind's focus, Varys turned his head slightly and offered a knowing smile. "Ah," he said, his tone shifting to one of smooth introduction. "Lady Rosalind, allow me to present some of the Queen's most trusted advisors." He gestured toward the trio. "This is Missandei of Nath," he said, inclining his head toward the young woman at the forefront. her royal advisor and trusted confidant. Missandei stepped forward with a serene smile, her voice soft yet confident. "Lady Stark," she said, her accent lilting slightly. "Lord Tyrion. It is an honor to welcome you to Dragonstone on behalf of Her Grace, Queen Daenerys Targaryen." Roslyn nodded, noting the grace with which Missandei spoke. "Thank you," she said warmly. "It is an honor to be here." Varys' gesture shifted to the tall man beside Missandei. "This is Grey Worm, commander of the Unsullied, the Queen's elite army." Grey Worm stepped forward with a curt nod. His expression was stoic, his voice quiet but firm. "I will ensure your safety while you are here," he said simply. Roslyn inclined her head in gratitude. "Your reputation precedes you, Commander." Finally, Varys turned to the older man. "And, of course, Sir Barristan Selmy, Lord Commander of the Queen's Guard." Sir Barristan stepped forward, his expression softening into a faint smile as he inclined his head. "Lady Stark," he said, his voice resonant and warm. "You have your mother's beauty. She would be proud to see you standing here." Roslyn blinked, her breath catching at the mention of her mother. "You knew my mother, Sir Barristan?" she asked, her voice quiet but filled with curiosity. "When she was a girl," he replied, his tone tinged with fondness and a touch of sorrow. "I fought in a tourney at Rosby Castle, back when your grandfather held it as his seat. It was a splendid event. Your uncle won the day, as I recall, and named your mother the Queen of Love and Beauty." "My uncle?" Roslyn repeated, astonished. She had always known so little of her mother's life, her memories were not her own, but fragments of stories passed down by others. Her mother had died bringing her into the world, leaving a hole that no tales could truly fill. Sir Barristan nodded. "He was a skilled knight, one of the finest on the lists that day. I remember the way your mother smiled when he placed the crown of flowers on her head. She had a light about her, kind, gracious, but strong in spirit. News of his death saddened me greatly, and even more so when I later heard of hers." Roslyn's chest tightened. "I never knew her," she admitted softly, her gaze dropping to the stone beneath her feet. "She died giving birth to me. All I have are second-hand stories, and even those are scarce." Sir Barristan's expression grew solemn, his gaze steady as he regarded her. "I am sorry for your loss, my lady. I cannot begin to imagine the pain of such an absence. But I can tell you this, your mother was a woman of great strength and grace, and though you may not have known her, she lives on in you." Roslyn's throat tightened at his words. "Thank you, Sir Barristan," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. The introductions complete, Varys extended a hand toward the towering gates of the fortress. "Shall we proceed?" he said smoothly. "The Queen is eager to meet with you, though I must caution, her patience is wearing thin. She has much to discuss, and her mind is ever focused on her goals." As the group made their way toward the castle, Roslyn couldn't help but marvel at the individuals surrounding her. Each of them carried the weight of their roles with grace and determination. This was not just the court of a queen, it was the assembly of a force poised to change the fate of Westeros. Yet, as they entered the shadowy halls of Dragonstone, Roslyn couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting would test not just alliances, but the very foundation of trust between these powerful figures. The air in the great hall of Dragonstone was heavy, as though the stone walls themselves carried the weight of the island's tumultuous history. The echoes of footsteps on the blackened floor only seemed to deepen the oppressive silence. Scattered across the ground were banners bearing the burning heart of Stannis Baratheon, discarded and trampled, their once proud sigil now nothing more than tattered cloth. In their place, resplendent and unyielding, hung the three-headed dragon of House Targaryen, its crimson embroidery stark against the dark, cold walls. At the far end of the hall, near the imposing throne that seemed to rise naturally from the volcanic stone of the island, stood two pairs of figures. Each duo seemed a world apart from the other, yet both exuded a sense of power and presence that could not be ignored. To the left, a man and a woman gave off the impression that they had stepped straight off the deck of a pirate ship. The man, broad-shouldered with a weathered face, had the look of someone who had spent his life battling the unforgiving sea. His coat, though fine in cut, bore the salt stains of countless voyages, and his boots scuffed the floor with the weight of years spent on rocking decks. Beside him stood a woman with fiery eyes and a defiant stance. Her clothing, practical but adorned with subtle touches of wealth, hinted at a life lived both in luxury and hardship. Her hand rested casually on the hilt of a dagger at her hip, her posture daring anyone to challenge her. To the right stood another pair, their appearance a striking contrast. The man had the sun-kissed skin of dawn, his features sharp and his bearing regal despite the understated simplicity of his attire. His gaze was steady and calculating, and there was a quiet confidence in the way he held himself. Beside him was a young woman with golden hair that shone like sunlight, her presence as striking as it was unexpected. The tension between the two groups was palpable, the room charged with the unspoken weight of alliances and rivalries. As Roslin and Tyrion entered, the four turned their gazes toward them, their scrutiny intense and unyielding. It was clear that each pair had their own agendas, their own loyalties, and their own stakes in the unfolding game. The advisors of the Queen guided Roslin and Tyrion through the great hall, their footsteps echoing off the cold stone as they approached the foot of the throne. The towering chair loomed ahead, carved from the island's black stone, and they paused, waiting as the advisors moved to take their places at either side of the throne. The room, filled with the hum of whispered conversation, seemed to hold its breath. A side door creaked open, and the silence in the hall deepened. Through the threshold stepped a woman, her presence like a storm rolling in across a calm sea. She was no older than Roslin, but there was a power in her that seemed to stretch back through the ages, a strength that demanded attention without a single word. Her white blonde hair cascaded down her back like a river of moonlight, sharp and striking against the black and red gown she wore. The gown was a masterpiece, as beautiful and intricate as a ball gown, yet there was an unmistakable edge to it, armor-like in its design, cut to allow for both grace and strength. The colors of her house, black and red, were woven into the fabric like blood and fire, reflecting the Targaryen legacy in every stitch. Roslin couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as she gazed at the woman before her. There was something electric in the air, a raw intensity that seemed to radiate from the Queen, a force that commanded more than just respect, it demanded submission. The woman's piercing purple eyes swept over them, cold and calculating, yet there was warmth in their depths, a fire that seemed to burn with a will of its own. She held herself with an effortless regal grace, every movement deliberate, yet as fluid as a river's current. She was a queen in every sense of the word, as though the title had been written into her very bones. Without a word, she took her seat upon the throne, her gaze never leaving the visitors. The advisors stood in silence, their posture almost as rigid as the throne itself. Missandei, standing at the foot of the throne, raised her voice, clear and unwavering. You stand in the presence of Queen Daenerys of House Targaryen, first of her name, Queen of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Protector of the Realm, Lady of the Seven Kingdoms, Queen of Meereen, Khaleesi of the Great Grass Sea, the Stormborn, the Unburnt, and the Breaker of Chains. Her words echoed through the hall, each title falling with weight, like the toll of a bell, marking Daenerys Targaryen's claim to the Iron Throne and to the hearts of her people. The air seemed to thicken with the sheer force of her identity, as if the room itself recognized the power she wielded. Roslin's breath caught in her throat. This was no mere claimant to the throne, no desperate rebel rallying for support, this was a queen who had earned each title, who had fought and bled to bring them into being. The room felt smaller under her gaze, yet at the same time, it expanded as if filled with the energy of dragons, storms, and fire. Daenerys Targaryen was a force of nature, and Roslin could not help but wonder if the world would ever be the same once she had finished reshaping it. The room was still as Daenerys spoke, her voice carrying through the hall with a regal calm that was impossible to ignore. My lords and ladies, she began, her gaze sweeping over the gathered assembly, I welcome you to Dragonstone. I am grateful that you have chosen to join me for this homecoming. Her words, while gracious, were heavy with purpose, and the atmosphere in the hall seemed to tighten in response, each noble feeling the weight of her resolve. She turned to Yara Greyjoy, the woman's presence undeniable. Lady Greyjoy, I've heard of your fleet's strength and the victories you have won on the seas. Your forces are much respected, and your loyalty is invaluable to my cause. Yara stepped forward with the ease of someone accustomed to being in command. Her dark eyes locked onto Daenerys with a steady gaze, and she nodded slightly, the barest flicker of respect in her features. Thank you, Your Grace, she said, her voice firm but not without a trace of admiration. And I must say, it is an honor to see another woman taking her rightful place. Too many have been denied their birthright, but you are different. There was an unspoken understanding between them, two women in a world where men so often ruled unchallenged. Yera's expression softened just a fraction as she spoke, her voice tinged with something more personal, more earnest than mere formality. Before Daenerys could respond, Varys, ever the observer, stepped forward, his gaze shifting slightly toward the man standing next to Yera. His voice, as always, was soft yet sharp, like a whisper carried on the wind. "It seems, my queen, that Lady Greyjoy has brought a guest with her," he remarked, his tone almost teasing, though there was a flicker of genuine curiosity in his eyes. Daenerys' attention followed Varys' gaze, and her brow furrowed ever so slightly as she regarded the man standing beside Yera. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a hard set to his face that spoke of a life spent in the harshest corners of the world. His features were weathered, as if the sea had shaped him. He had the look of a man who had seen much but had little care for what others thought of him. "This is my husband," Yera said, her voice betraying no warmth, "Graydon of House Goodbrother." She spoke the words like they were nothing more than a formality, her eyes cold as they flicked toward him. It was clear from the lack of affection in her tone that her marriage to this man was not a love match, nor even a bond of friendship. There was something far more pragmatic about it, an arrangement forged by necessity rather than desire. Daenerys' lips pressed together for a moment, her eyes narrowing as she took in the man who stood beside Yera. Her tone was measured, but there was a slight flicker of surprise in her voice. "I was unaware you were married, my lady," she said, her gaze never leaving Yera. Yera's reply came swiftly, with a sharpness that could not be mistaken for anything but the truth. "Needs must, your grace," she said, her gaze flicking briefly to Graydon before returning to Daenerys. "A sentiment, I think, you understand. Not all alliances are made with the heart." There was a weight to Yera's words, and Daenerys nodded slightly, her understanding clear. She had forged many alliances in her own life, some born of necessity, others from a desire to see her vision realized. The burden of leadership often meant making choices that were not of the heart, but of the mind, for the sake of something greater. "Indeed," Daenerys replied, her voice calm but knowing. "The realm demands sacrifices from us all. But we are here now, and we must ensure that the sacrifices we make will bring about a world worth living in." Graydon's presence, though not overtly welcome, was tolerated by the Queen for now. There were far more pressing matters to address, and Yera's alliance was too important to be marred by the personal nature of the arrangement. Still, the subtle tension in the room was not lost on anyone, and the atmosphere grew heavy with the weight of their unspoken understanding. Daenerys, ever the Queen, did not allow the moment to linger, her commanding presence dispelling any tension. Her gaze shifted to the young man standing to her left, his golden brown skin and sharp features a clear mark of his Dornish heritage. "Lord Tristan," she greeted, her voice carrying warmth but also an undercurrent of expectation. "Did your uncle not wish to join us?" Tristan Martell stepped forward, inclining his head respectfully. Though young, he carried himself with a dignity that belied his years. His dark eyes met Daenerys unflinchingly as he replied, "I commanded my uncle to remain in Dorne, your grace. Since the death of my father and my ascension as Prince of Sunspear, I did not want to leave our lands unprotected." He hesitated for a moment, then added with a faint, confident smile, "But he told me to assure you that he is with you in this endeavor, and in everything you seek to accomplish in the future." Daenerys regarded him for a moment, her piercing violet eyes measuring his sincerity. Then, her gaze shifted slightly, landing on the woman standing beside him, a vision of golden beauty with hair cascading like sunlight and a composure that seemed almost regal. "So instead," Daenerys said, her voice taking on a lighter, conversational tone, "you brought your beautiful wife, the Lady Myrcella." At the mention of her name, Myrcella Baratheon, or rather, Myrcella Martell, offered a gracious smile and a small curtsy. Her green eyes sparkled with intelligence and charm, but there was a steeliness behind them that spoke of someone who had endured far more than her delicate appearance might suggest. "It is an honor to stand before you, your grace," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Prince Tristan thought it fitting that we both lend our support to your cause." Before Daenerys could respond, Grey Worm, ever vigilant and direct, stepped forward. His voice, though quiet, carried a pointed question that cut through the formalities. "Tell me, Lady Martell," he said, his gaze unwavering as he addressed Myrcella, "does your brother not currently sit on our queen's throne?" The room seemed to hold its breath as Myrcella's expression shifted, her smile fading slightly into something more somber. She glanced briefly at Tristan, who gave her an almost imperceptible nod of reassurance. Turning back to Grey Worm, she answered with steady resolve, Tommen sits on the Iron Throne, yes. But I am not blind to the circumstances that placed him there, nor the forces that manipulate him. Her voice gained strength as she continued, I have no love for the Lannisters who wield power in his name. My loyalty lies with my husband, my new family, and with the future of this realm. I believe that future is with Queen Daenerys. Daenerys observed the exchange in silence, her expression unreadable as she considered Myrcilla's words. At last, she inclined her head slightly, a sign of her acceptance, if not yet full trust. It is a rare thing, Daenerys said, to see someone acknowledge the complexities of loyalty and power so plainly. I hope your actions will prove as steadfast as your words, Lady Martell. Myrcilla nodded, her golden hair catching the light as she did so. They will, Your Grace. The exchange left a lingering tension in the room, but Daenerys quickly moved to reclaim the focus of the gathering. Prince Tristan, she said, her tone shifting back to one of command, you and your house have long been allies to the Targaryens. I hope that alliance will be as strong now as it was during the reign of my ancestors. It will be stronger, Tristan promised, his voice steady and sincere. Dawn stands ready to fight for you, Your Grace. Whatever you need, we will provide. Daenerys nodded, a faint smile playing on her lips. Good, she said, her tone carrying the weight of expectation. We will need every ally and every sword if we are to take back the Seven Kingdoms. Daenerys' violet eyes fixed on Roslyn, her gaze sharp yet curious. Lady Stark, I presume, she said at last, her voice regal and measured, carrying the weight of both greeting and expectation. I must admit, your presence here surprises me. I was expecting your husband. Roslyn stepped forward, her chin held high and her voice steady. We decided I would come on behalf of our house, Your Grace, she replied, inclining her head respectfully. My husband is a northerner through and through. The South has never held much appeal for him. Daenerys studied her for a moment longer, as if weighing her words, before her lips curved into a faint smile. And yet, here you are, Lady Stark. I wonder if the North has underestimated its strength in you. Roslyn returned the smile, though she sensed the subtle test within the Queen's words. The North understands strength comes in many forms, Your Grace. Daenerys's expression softened slightly, her attention shifting to the figure standing beside Roslyn. And I see you've kindly returned my hand of the king to me, she said, gesturing to Tyrion with a raised brow. Tyrion, ever quick with his wit, stepped forward with a theatrical bow. Your Grace, he said, his tone laced with dry humor, while I am delighted to be back in your esteemed company, I must confess it wasn't entirely voluntary. Lady Stark is rather persuasive. Roslyn turned to him with a faint smirk. I prefer to think of it as being efficient, Lord Tyrion. Daenerys chuckled softly at the exchange, though her sharp gaze didn't waver. Efficiency is a quality I value, she said, addressing Roslyn once more. But tell me, Lady Stark, why should I trust you? Your house has long been a symbol of loyalty to the North. What compels you to venture south and seek me out now? Roslyn took a steadying breath, her eyes locked on Daenerys's sharp, piercing gaze. She had prepared for this moment, knowing that words alone might not be enough to sway the Dragon Queen. Yet, she stood firm. Because the war for the Seven Kingdoms will not be won by any one region, Your Grace, Roslyn said, her voice steady and filled with conviction. The North knows winter better than anyone, and with it comes a darkness that will consume us all if we remain divided. I am here because I believe you possess not just the strength, but the vision to unite us, not simply to claim a throne, but to defend the realm. Daenerys tilted her head, her expression unreadable, though a spark of curiosity flickered in her violet eyes. Defend the realm, she repeated, her tone carrying a mix of intrigue and skepticism. Defend it from what? The Lannisters. Roslyn opened her mouth to reply, but Tyrion stepped forward with a somber nod, his voice low and deliberate. The dead, Your Grace, he said, breaking the uneasy silence. Daenerys raised a brow, her skepticism giving way to confusion. The dead, she echoed, her gaze shifting between Tyrion and Roslyn. What game is this, Lord Tyrion? It's no game, Roslyn interjected, her tone firm. There is a force rising in the north, a force unlike any you've faced before. The dead do not care for crowns or banners. They serve no house, no king. They serve only death itself. Daenerys's brows knitted together, doubt flickering in her expression. And you expect me to believe this tale of walking corpses and winter phantoms? Forgive me, Lady Stark, but I did not build my armies on fables. Tyrion sighed, stepping closer to the throne. Your Grace, he began, I, too, was skeptical when I first heard these stories. But the reports from Castle Black are undeniable, as are the testimonies of those who have seen the White Walkers and their army firsthand. The North does not frighten easily, yet they are united in their fear of this threat. Roslyn took the opportunity to press forward, her voice urgent. My husband, Robb Stark, has sent ravens to every corner of the North, rallying the bannermen not for a battle of men, but for survival. The wall has seen the dead rise. Even now, the Night King marches toward us, and every soul he slays joins his ranks. Daenerys leaned back in her throne, her fingers drumming against the armrest. Her expression was thoughtful, but her wariness remained. And what would you have me do, Lady Stark? She asked. Abandon my rightful claim to the Iron Throne to chase shadows in the North? Roslyn shook her head, her voice steady but imploring. No, Your Grace. I would ask you to see the larger battle ahead. The Iron Throne will mean nothing if the living are wiped out. But if we stand together, if your dragons fight alongside the North's armies, we have a chance to defeat the dead and reclaim the Seven Kingdoms for the living. The room fell into a tense silence, the weight of the conversation pressing down on everyone present. Daenerys' piercing violet eyes remained fixed on Roslyn, as though searching for even the faintest hint of deception. The young Lady Stark stood her ground, her posture resolute, her expression unwavering. She met the Queen's gaze head-on, the fire in her own eyes a reflection of the unshakable Stark determination. Daenerys' gaze finally shifted, flickering toward her advisors. Tyrion gave a slow, measured nod, his face etched with the weight of the truth he had come to believe. Varys, ever enigmatic, stood impassive, his hands clasped before him and his face unreadable. Grey Worm and Missandei exchanged a glance but said nothing, their loyalty to Daenerys steadfast. After what felt like an eternity, Daenerys leaned forward, resting her elbows on the arms of her throne, her hands steepled beneath her chin. Her voice, calm but edged with steel, broke the silence. And if I were to believe this, she began slowly, each word deliberate, if I were to hold my campaign and join you in this fight, say we win, what happens then? Roslyn didn't hesitate, her voice steady and clear. Then you will have the full support of the North to claim your throne, Your Grace. My husband and I will bend the knee, and we will call on every bannerman and ally to do the same. Together, we will ensure you sit on the Iron Throne. Daenerys raised a skeptical eyebrow. Just like that, she asked, her tone laced with a hint of incredulity. You would so willingly yield to a Targaryen? Roslyn's expression softened, but her conviction did not falter. The North remembers, Your Grace, she said. We remember the cost of division, the price of war. We also remember the strength of unity when it is forged for a greater cause. My family has suffered more than most in these wars, but we know when pride must be set aside for survival. The North needs a queen strong enough to lead, not just through winter, but beyond it. Daenerys leaned back slightly on her throne, her gaze narrowing as she scrutinized Roslyn with an intensity that felt as piercing as dragon fire. Roslyn drew a measured breath, gathering her courage before speaking. Your Grace, if I may speak frankly, she began, her voice steady but tinged with the weight of her words. We come from very different worlds, you and I, but I believe we share more in common than it might seem at first glance. She paused, meeting Daenerys' unwavering gaze before continuing. 6 years ago, I was no one, just one of many free children, a girl lost in a sea of siblings, with a father who cared more about his power than his own blood. He sold me to the highest bidder without a second thought. I was fortunate, beyond measure, that the man he sold me to turned out to be my soulmate. Robb saved me from a life of obscurity, something I think you can understand, given the bond you shared with your first husband. Daenerys' expression softened slightly, a flicker of recognition passing through her eyes as she nodded. But my story didn't end there, Roslyn continued. When war came, I was left to fend for myself in a strange city surrounded by strangers while Robb fought to secure our future. I endured horrors that haunt me to this day. I was assaulted and humiliated, stripped of my dignity, and barely made it out alive. I killed a man to survive. She hesitated, glancing briefly at Myrcella, who stood nearby. Now was not the time to confess the true weight of that act, not here, not yet. I gave birth to my son in the aftermath of it all. He is my greatest joy, the light of my life, but I have also lost children, babies who will never take their first steps, who will never grow into the people they were meant to be. That pain never fades. Rosalind's voice grew more resolute as she pressed on. Through it all, I have adapted, changed, and endured. I have become a leader in a world where men refuse to see me as their equal, let alone their superior. I have stood by my husband as he has endured loss after loss, his father, his brothers, his mother, and I have stayed strong, because that is what women do. We endure. We fight. We survive. She stepped forward, her eyes glistening but determined, her voice trembling with emotion. And now, I stand before you not as a lady of a castle, but as a mother who is begging you, as one who has also loved and lost, to save my son. Without you, your grace, he is as good as dead already. The dead do not discriminate between kings, queens, or children. But you have the power to stop them. You have the power to save him. The hall was silent, the weight of Rosalind's words hanging in the air. Daenerys's expression shifted, her eyes softening as she regarded the woman standing before her. The tension in the room seemed to ebb, replaced by an undercurrent of understanding, a shared bond of pain, loss, and unyielding strength. Finally, Daenerys spoke, her voice quiet but firm. You have suffered much, Lady Stark, more than anyone should ever have to endure. I will not promise what I cannot yet give, but you have my word that I will consider your plea, not just as a queen, but as a woman who understands the lengths we go to for those we love. Rosalind inclined her head respectfully, though the weight of her plea still hung heavily in the air. A flicker of hope ignited in her chest as Daenerys acknowledged her. Thank you, Your Grace, she said softly, her voice steady but charged with the raw emotion of the moment. That is all I can ask. Daenerys turned her piercing gaze to Tyrion. I presume you have a plan, Lord Tyrion, she asked, her tone edged with a mixture of curiosity and expectation. Tyrion stepped forward, clasping his hands before him. Of course, Your Grace, he replied. The North cannot prepare itself for the true threat, the dead, because it is already dealing with a more immediate and mortal danger. Tywin Lannister, Rosalind interjected, her voice laced with quiet fury. He attacked Castle Black, our first line of defense against the darkness. He killed my father and brother-in-law, two good men who we desperately needed for the fight to come. The last word we received, Tyrion continued, was that my father had left the wall. He's marching south, currently headed toward Last Hearth, but his ultimate destination is no mystery. Winterfell, Daenerys said, the word sharp and final. If Tywin reaches Winterfell before the dead, Rosalind said grimly, we'll lose many brave men, men we cannot afford to lose. And without them, we won't stand a chance against the dead. If we survive long enough to face them, that is. We need to stop Tywin before he ever sets foot in Winterfell. And how do you propose to do that? Daenerys asked, her skepticism apparent. Tyrion stepped closer to the throne, his voice measured but purposeful. We need to draw him back to King's Landing. We must make him believe the crown is in peril. That may be easier than you think, Tristan Martell interjected from where he stood with Myrcella. All eyes turned to him. Daenerys's brow furrowed. How so? Tristan folded his arms, his expression darkening. Before we departed the Baratheon court, there was an assassination attempt. A man tried to kill the king and his newborn children. He did this in your name, Your Grace. In my name? Daenerys asked sharply, her voice filled with incredulity. Your Grace, I can assure you, Tristan said quickly, we know you would never order such a thing. But the man claimed he acted for you. If one man felt so inspired to take such a reckless action, it's likely others might do the same. Daenerys's lips pressed into a thin line, her frustration evident. I would never stoop to such dishonor. Of course not, Your Grace, Tyrion said smoothly, but this can still work to our advantage. Chaos breeds opportunity, and if we stoke the fires just enough, the capital will erupt on its own. How? Daenerys demanded, her eyes narrowing. Ursula stepped forward, her voice calm but deliberate. My mother, she began, before correcting herself, the Dowager Queen, informed me before we left that she is planning the most extravagant naming day celebration ever seen, for the twins. Rosalind's eyes widened slightly. A public parade for the children, she asked. Ursula nodded. A feast, a tourney, and endless displays of Lannister wealth, all while the realm is at war. The people are starving, and their own children are dying. If the crown flaunts such excess during their suffering, they'll rise up on their own. Tyrion finished. A spark of cunning lit in his eyes. Lady Rosalind and I had devised a plan to send food parcels into the city, inspired